Sergeant Cole Hartigan slammed his fist onto the table so hard that the coffee cups rattled, and he pointed straight at the young woman standing at the end of the line. "You don't belong here," he snarled, his voice cracking with contempt. "Women don't hold a rifle in this unit, not on my watch." The room went silent. Every soldier turned to look at her. But before we go further, hit that subscribe button, follow this story all the way to the end, and drop a comment telling me which city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story has traveled. The morning had started like any other at Fort Braddock, with the sun barely climbing over the ridge of pine trees that surrounded the training grounds and a layer of cold mist still clinging to the grass. Recruits stood in formation, back straight, eyes forward, breath visible in the chill air. Among them stood a young woman named Emily Carter, 24 years old, her uniform pressed her boots, polished, her face calm in a way that unsettled the men around her more than any display of nerves would have. She had arrived 3 weeks earlier, transferred from a support unit after her scores on the marksmanship qualification test had raised eyebrows all the way up the chain of command. Nobody quite believed the numbers. Perfect scores 3 times in a row on a range that had broken grown men who'd been shooting since childhood. And so, out of curiosity or perhaps out of a desire to prove the numbers wrong, the base commander had ordered her transferred to the elite marksmanship training unit under Sergeant Cole Hartigan, a man whose reputation for toughness was matched only by his reputation for believing women had no place in combat roles. Hartigan was 58 years old, a veteran of 2 wars, his face weathered like old leather, his eyes the color of gunmetal. He'd trained hundreds of soldiers over 3 decades, and not one woman had ever made it through his program. Not because the Army hadn't sent them a few had tried years back, but because he had personally ensured through impossible standards and merciless treatment that they washed out before the 2nd week. "Fall in," Hartigan barked, and the recruits snapped into tighter lines. He walked down the row slowly, his boots crunching against the gravel, his eyes scanning each face like he was looking for weakness, for a crack he could pry open. When he reached Emily, he stopped. He didn't say anything at first. He just stood there staring at her, waiting for her to flinch. She didn't. "Carter," he said finally, his voice low and dangerous. "You know why you're here?" "Yes, Sergeant," she replied, her voice steady. "Enlighten me." "Because my scores qualified me for this unit." A few of the men snickered. Hartigan's jaw tightened. "Scores don't win wars, Carter. Scores don't drag your buddy's body out from under mortar fire. Scores don't keep you steady when a man's screaming 3 feet from you with his leg blown off. You understand me?" "Yes, Sergeant." "I don't think you do." He turned and addressed the whole formation, now his voice rising, carrying across the yard. "Let me be clear with all of you. This unit does not exist to make anyone feel included. This unit exists to produce the finest marksmen this Army has ever fielded. And I have never, not once, in 30 years, seen a woman who could hold up under what this program demands." He turned back to Emily. "You'll quit within the week. They always do." Emily's expression didn't change, but inside something hardened, something that had been building for years, ever since she was a girl, watching her father clean his hunting rifle on their back porch in rural Montana, ever since the day he'd handed her that same rifle when she was 9 years old, and told her that a person's worth wasn't measured by what others expected of them, but by what they were willing to endure to prove those expectations wrong. "With respect, Sergeant," she said quietly, "I don't plan on quitting." The yard went dead silent. Hartigan's eyes narrowed, and for a moment something flickered across his face, not quite anger, not quite curiosity, but something in between. "We'll see," he said, and then he turned and walked away, his boots striking the gravel like a countdown clock. That night in the barracks, Emily lay on her bunk, staring at the ceiling, while the other recruits whispered around her, thinking she couldn't hear. "She won't last 3 days, one voice muttered. "Hartigan's gonna break her, like he broke that other girl back in 2009, said another. "Remember her? Cried in the mess hall and never came back." Emily closed her eyes and breathed slowly in and out the way her father had taught her. Fear was just noise, he used to say. You don't have to listen to it. The next morning began before dawn, with Hartigan rousing the unit for a 12-mile ruck march through terrain designed to break ankles and spirits alike. The pack on Emily's back weighed nearly 60 pounds, digging into her shoulders with every step, and the trail wound uphill through mud and loose rock for the first 6 miles straight. Men around her groaned, cursed under their breath, and one recruit, a broad-shouldered kid named Danny Reyes, kept glancing back at her. Waiting, it seemed, for her to fall behind so he could feel better about his own exhaustion. She didn't fall behind. By mile 8, 3 recruits had dropped out, unable to continue, their legs cramping, their will breaking under the weight of the pack and the relentless pace Hartigan set from the front. He didn't slow down for anyone. He didn't offer encouragement. He simply moved like a machine and expected everyone to keep up or be left in the dust. Emily kept up. When they reached the final ridge, Hartigan called a halt, and the remaining recruits collapsed onto the ground, gasping, sweat pouring down their faces despite the cold morning air. Emily remained standing, breathing hard but upright, her hands resting on her hips as she looked out over the valley below. Hartigan noticed. He always noticed. "You're going to have to try harder than a ruck march to shake her, Sergeant," Danny muttered under his breath to another recruit, not realizing Hartigan was close enough to hear. Hartigan said nothing, but his eyes lingered on Emily a moment longer than necessary before he turned and ordered the unit back into formation for the return trip. Over the following days, Hartigan escalated everything. He assigned her extra duties, cleaning latrines after a full day of training, standing watch on the coldest nights, running additional drills after the rest of the unit had been dismissed. Each time she completed the task without complaint, without a single word of protest, and each time Hartigan watched from a distance, waiting for the moment she would finally break. It never came. One evening, nearly 2 weeks into her time with the unit, Hartigan found her alone at the range after hours practicing in the fading light. She hadn't asked permission. She hadn't announced her presence. She was simply there, lying prone in the dirt, her rifle steady, her breathing controlled, squeezing off rounds at a target 500 meters downrange, with a consistency that made his chest tighten with something he refused to name. "What are you doing out here, Carter?" he barked, striding toward her. She didn't stop shooting. "Training, Sergeant. Nobody authorized extra range time. Nobody said I couldn't." He stood over her, arms crossed, watching as she fired 3 more rounds, each one striking within inches of the last. His jaw worked silently for a moment. "You think hitting paper makes you a soldier?" She lowered her rifle, finally looking up at him, her eyes calm but unflinching. "No, Sergeant, but it's a start." Something about her answer irritated him more than any defiance could have. He wanted her to crack, to show fear, to give him a reason to send her packing back to whatever desk job she'd come from. Instead, she just kept looking at him, brooding as if she had all the patience in the world and none of it was going to run out because of him. "Get some sleep," he finally said, turning on his heel. "Tomorrow's worse." Tomorrow was worse, and the day after that was worse still. Hartigan threw everything he had at her: sleep deprivation drills, live fire exercises under simulated stress, verbal abuse designed to shatter concentration, sudden reassignments meant to throw off any rhythm she'd built. Other recruits began to notice the pattern, began to whisper that the sergeant had a personal vendetta, that this wasn't training anymore. It was a war of attrition aimed at one person. Danny Reyes, who had initially doubted her, found himself defending her one night in the barracks when another recruit made a crude comment about why she was really there. "You don't know her," Danny said sharply, surprising even himself with the heat in his voice. "You've watched her shoot. You've watched her march. She's earned every inch of this more than most of us have." The recruit scoffed. "She won't last." "You want to bet on that," Danny said, and the room fell quiet. 3 weeks into her assignment, the unit was informed that a live fire qualification exercise would take place at the end of the month, a brutal multi-stage test that combined marksmanship, endurance, and tactical decision-making under pressure. It was the exercise that determined who would move forward into advanced sniper training and who would be sent back to their previous assignments. In 30 years, no woman had ever passed it under Hartigan's supervision. Most hadn't even made it to the exercise at all. Emily intended to be the first. The night before the exercise, she sat alone outside the barracks, cleaning her rifle by lantern light, the metal cool and familiar under her hands. Footsteps approached, and then she looked up to see Hartigan standing a few feet away, his expression unreadable in the dim light. "You scared Carter?" he asked, his voice quieter than she'd ever heard it. She considered the question honestly before answering. "Yes, Sergeant." He seemed surprised by the admission. "Most people lie when I ask that." "I'm not most people," she said, resuming her work on the rifle. "Fear doesn't mean I'll fail. It just means I understand what's at stake." He watched her for a long moment, something shifting behind his eyes, some old memory surfacing that he quickly pushed back down. There was a woman, he said, finally his voice rough, back in 91. Went through selection with my old unit. Best shot I'd ever seen. Better than half the men who made it through. He paused, his jaw tightening. She didn't make it home. Emily looked up at him, understanding beginning to dawn on her. The anger, the resistance, the impossible standards weren't really about doubting her ability at all. They were about fear. His fear. I'm not her, Emily said softly. No. Hartigan agreed, his voice barely above a whisper. You're not. He turned and walked away into the darkness, leaving Emily alone with her rifle and her thoughts, and for the first time since she'd arrived, she wondered if perhaps the man who seemed most determined to see her fail might actually be the one most afraid of watching her succeed and lose her the way he'd lost someone before. The morning of the qualification exercise arrived cold and clear. The sky, a hard blue, stretching over the range where 23 recruits stood in formation, breath fogging in the early light. Only 23 remained out of the original 40 who had started the program. Emily stood among them, her rifle slung across her back, her face a mask of calm concentration that hid the storm of nerves churning beneath. Hartigan walked the line one final time before the exercise began, his eyes settling briefly on each recruit, but lingering longest on her. Today, you find out who you really are, he announced to the group, his voice carrying across the range. Not who you think you are, not who you want to be, who you actually are when everything is on the line and there's nowhere left to hide. He paused, and for just a moment, his eyes met Emily's, and something passed between them that neither had words for. Let's begin, he said. The first stage tested basic marksmanship under standard conditions. Nothing especially difficult for someone with Emily's scores, and she moved through it with practiced precision, her shots grouping tightly at every distance. But the second stage introduced complications, firing after a sprint, heart rate, elevated lungs, burning hands, trembling slightly from exertion as she tried to steady her aim on distant targets that seemed to swim in her vision. She missed 2 shots she shouldn't have missed. Danny, watching from the sidelines after completing his own run, felt his stomach drop. Come on, Carter, he muttered under his breath. Come on. By the third stage, a stress shoot exercise involving simulated combat scenarios, sudden target appearances, and time pressure that left no room for hesitation. 3 more recruits had washed out entirely, their scores falling below the minimum threshold. Emily pushed forward, her breathing ragged sweat stinging her eyes, every muscle in her body screaming with fatigue after hours of continuous exertion. Hartigan watched from his position near the command tent, his expression giving away nothing, though his hands were clenched so tightly behind his back that his knuckles had gone white. The fourth stage was the one that broke people. A 500-meter shot wind gusting unpredictably across the range target, partially obscured by simulated terrain features, time limit set impossibly short. Recruits had exactly 90 seconds to calculate windage, adjust for elevation control, their breathing, and deliver a single shot that would either qualify them or eliminate them from consideration entirely. Emily lay prone in the dirt, her rifle steady despite the trembling in her exhausted muscles. Her eye pressed to the scope as she calculated the wind drift, adjusting her aim with the kind of instinctive precision that came only from thousands of hours of practice that had started on her father's back porch when she was 9 years old, practice that had continued through every hardship, every doubt, every voice that had told her she didn't belong. She exhaled slowly. The shot rang out across the range, sharp and clean, echoing off the distant hills. Silence followed. Every recruit turned to watch the target marker in the distance, waiting for the signal that would confirm the hit. Danny held his breath. Even Hartigan, standing rigid near the command tent, found himself leaning forward slightly, his jaw tight, his eyes fixed on the distant target with an intensity he hadn't shown all day. The flag went up. Dead center. A ripple of astonished murmurs passed through the recruits, still watching, and Danny let out a whoop of triumph before quickly catching himself, glancing nervously toward Hartigan's reaction. But the sergeant said nothing. He simply stood there, staring at the distant target, something unreadable moving across his weathered face. But the exercise wasn't over, not yet. There was still the final stage, the one no recruit had ever been told about in advance, the one reserved only for those who had somehow, against every expectation, made it this far. And what awaited Emily in that final test would reveal not just whether she could shoot, but whether she could carry the weight of what came next, a truth about Sergeant Hartigan's past, about the woman he'd lost decades ago, and about a decision that would determine far more than just her place in this unit. Because as the last recruits fell away, and as Emily stood alone at the final barrier, Hartigan approached her one more time, his face pale beneath its weathered tan, and said words that would change everything she thought she understood about why he'd fought so hard to see her fail. "There's one more test," he said quietly, "and it's not on paper." Emily stood still, her chest rising and falling from exhaustion, her hands still faintly trembling from the recoil of the last shot. "What kind of test isn't on paper, Sergeant?" she asked, her voice hoarse but steady. Hartigan didn't answer right away. He glanced over his shoulder at the other recruits now being dismissed by the range officer, their voices fading as they filed back toward the barracks, exhausted and relieved the ordeal was over for them. When the last of them disappeared over the ridge, he turned back to Emily, and for the first time since she'd arrived at Fort Braddock, she saw something in his eyes that looked almost like vulnerability. "Walk with me," he said. She hesitated. Every instinct told her this was unusual against protocol, something that shouldn't be happening after a formal qualification exercise. But she followed him anyway, falling into step beside him as they walked along the tree line, bordering the range, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across the dirt path. 31 years ago, Hartigan began, his voice low, almost swallowed by the wind. The Army ran a pilot program. Experimental. They wanted to see if women could handle sniper training. Real sniper training, not the watered-down stuff they do now for publicity. I was young then, 27, second in command of the unit running the program. Emily said nothing, sensing that any interruption might cause him to stop talking altogether, and she desperately wanted to hear the rest. "There was a recruit named Sarah Blackwood." He continued, his jaw tightening around the name, as though it cost him something physical to say it. "Best natural shot I ever saw. Better than me, if I'm honest, and I don't say that about many people." He paused, staring out at the darkening horizon. She had this way of reading wind, like it was speaking directly to her. Never wasted a shot, never wasted a word, either quiet, focused, tougher than half the men in that unit combined. "What happened to her?" Emily asked softly. Hartigan's hands clenched at his sides. "The Army sent our unit into a classified operation overseas. Extraction mission gone wrong. We were pinned down for 6 hours, taking fire from 3 directions, and Sarah held a position on a ridge that kept an entire enemy squad from flanking us." His voice cracked just slightly, just enough for Emily to hear the wound beneath it. "She saved 11 lives that day, including mine. But she didn't make it," Emily said quietly, already knowing the answer. "No." Hartigan stopped walking, staring down at his own hands as if seeing them for the first time. "A round caught her position 20 minutes before extraction arrived. I was 50 meters away. I heard it happen. I couldn't get to her in time." Emily felt something tighten in her own chest, a wave of grief for a woman she'd never met, whose name she'd never even heard until this moment. "I'm so sorry, Sergeant." "Don't be sorry," he said sharply, turning to face her, his eyes suddenly fierce again. "Be angry. Because after she died, the Army buried the whole program, called it a failed experiment. Said the psychological toll on male soldiers working alongside female combatants wasn't worth the operational benefit." He laughed bitterly, a sound with no humor in it at all, as if losing her had anything to do with her being a woman, and not with a broken command structure that sent us into an operation without proper air support. "And you blamed yourself," Emily said. Hartigan's silence was answer enough. "So when they told me you were coming," he continued after a long moment, his voice rough with old pain, "when I saw those scores, I thought, I can't watch this happen again. I can't stand at the edge of a range and watch another woman with that kind of talent walk into a system that will chew her up and spit her out, or worse, get her killed because nobody above her cared enough to protect her the way they should have." Emily absorbed this feeling, the weight of 3 weeks of hostility rearrange itself in her mind, transforming from cruelty into something far more complicated, something rooted in grief so old and so deep that it had calcified into a wall he built around every recruit who reminded him of what he'd lost. "So you tried to break me," she said, "to protect me." "I tried to break you," he admitted, "because if you couldn't survive training, you sure as hell couldn't survive what comes after. I needed to know, really know, whether you had what it takes or whether you were going to end up another name I'd have to carry." Emily stepped closer, her exhaustion forgotten for a moment, replaced by a fierce, burning clarity. "Sergeant, I understand grief. I understand fear, but you don't get to make that decision for me. I didn't come here to be protected. I came here to prove I belong on my own terms, standing on my own 2 feet, not because someone decided I was too fragile to face what Sarah Blackwood faced. Hartigan studied her for a long, silent moment, something shifting behind his weathered eyes, not quite surrender, but something close to it. That's exactly what she would have said, he murmured. Then maybe, Emily said carefully, the way to honor her isn't to keep women like me off the range. Maybe it's to make sure we're better prepared than she was, better supported, so it doesn't happen again. The words hung in the air between them, heavy with implication, and for a long moment, neither of them spoke. Somewhere in the distance, a hawk cried out, circling over the ridge, where the qualification exercise had taken place just hours before. There's one more test, Hartigan finally said, repeating his earlier words, though his tone had changed entirely, less a threat now, more an invitation. It's not about marksmanship, it's about judgment, about what you do when the shot isn't the hard part. I'm listening, Emily said. Tomorrow at 0500, report to the East Range. Full combat load. And Carter? He paused and something almost like respect flickered across his face. Bring everything you've got, because if you pass this, there's no more question about whether you belong. Not from me, not from anyone. That night, sleep didn't come easily. Emily lay on her bunk staring at the ceiling, replaying every word Hartigan had said, turning them over in her mind like stones she was trying to understand the shape of. Around her, the barracks had gone quiet, most of the recruits already asleep after the brutal exhaustion of the day's exercise. But she could hear Danny shifting restlessly in the bunk across from hers. "You awake?" he whispered. "Yeah," she said. "You did good today, really good." He paused. What did Hartigan want? After the exercise, I mean. "I saw you two walking out by the tree line." Emily considered how much to share, then decided Danny had earned some honesty after weeks of quietly standing up for her when others hadn't. "He told me about someone he lost, a long time ago, someone who made him afraid of watching this happen again." Danny was quiet for a moment. "That why he's been so hard on you?" "Yeah," she said, "I think so. Guess that makes him human then, even if he's a miserable pain in the ass most days." Danny chuckled softly, and despite herself, Emily smiled in the darkness. "You gonna be ready for tomorrow, whatever this last test is?" "I don't know," she admitted, "but I'm not backing down." "Never thought you would," Danny said, and then the barracks fell silent again, leaving Emily alone with her thoughts staring up at the ceiling until exhaustion finally pulled her under. The next morning arrived before the sun. The sky still dark and heavy with stars when Emily reported to the East Range exactly as instructed. Her combat load secured her rifle clean and ready. Hartigan was already there, standing beside two other instructors. She didn't recognize their faces, stern and unreadable in the pre-dawn darkness. "This is Master Sergeant Willis," Hartigan said, gesturing to a tall, broad-shouldered man with graying temples, "and Staff Sergeant Gwen." He gestured to a woman standing slightly apart, her posture rigid, her eyes sharp and assessing as she looked Emily over. "They'll be observing today's exercise alongside me." Emily's stomach tightened. Additional observers meant this test carried weight beyond what she'd already been told. "Understood, Sergeant. Here's the scenario." Hartigan continued, his voice shifting into the clipped professional tone he used during formal briefings. "You're on overwatch for a simulated extraction operation. Your team is pinned down by hostile forces in a compound roughly 800 meters from your position. You have 3 simulated targets to neutralize, but here's the complication." He paused, his eyes locking onto hers with unusual intensity. "One of those targets isn't hostile. It's a simulated civilian, deliberately placed to test your judgment under pressure. If you fire on the wrong target, you fail. If you hesitate too long and your simulated team takes casualties, you fail. This isn't about hitting paper anymore, Carter. This is about knowing when not to pull the trigger." Emily absorbed this understanding immediately. The deeper meaning behind the exercise. This was the test. Sarah Blackwood never got the chance to take the test that might have changed everything if someone had thought to develop it decades earlier. "I understand, Sergeant," she said. "Get into position," he ordered. She moved into the designated overwatch position, a rocky outcropping overlooking a mock compound built from shipping containers and plywood structures designed to simulate an urban environment. Through her scope, she could see the layout, 3 structures, multiple points of potential threat shadows, moving behind windows that could represent hostiles or innocents impossible to distinguish at this range without careful observation. Simulation begins in 10 seconds, Willis announced over the radio, his voice crackling through her earpiece. Emily steadied her breathing, her finger resting alongside the trigger guard. Not yet on the trigger itself, her eye pressed to the scope as she began scanning the compound with methodical precision. The first target appeared almost immediately, a silhouette in tactical gear weapon, visible, moving with clear, hostile intent toward the position where her simulated team was supposedly pinned down. She fired. The target dropped a confirmed hit, registered by the range system, and a voice crackled through her earpiece, confirming the elimination. But there was no time to celebrate. A second figure emerged from the adjacent structure, this one moving more cautiously, and Emily's finger hovered near the trigger as she studied the details through her scope. No visible weapon, hands positioned differently, movement pattern inconsistent with hostile behavior. Her heart pounded. This could be the civilian, or it could be a hostile using civilian appearance as cover, a tactic she'd been trained to recognize as increasingly common in modern combat scenarios. She held her fire, watching, waiting, her breathing controlled despite the tension screaming through every nerve in her body. "Carter, your team is taking fire," Willis's voice announced through her earpiece, urgency creeping into his tone. "You need to make a decision." Emily's eyes remained locked on the second figure, watching for any indication of hostile intent, any sign of a weapon, any movement that would confirm the threat. The figure paused near a doorway, and for just a moment, she caught a clearer angle. No weapon, hands raised slightly, a posture of fear rather than aggression. "Holding fire on target 2E," she said into her radio, her voice steady despite the pressure building around her. Non-hostile indicators present, continuing to scan for primary threat. A tense silence followed, broken only by the sound of simulated gunfire echoing from the compound speakers designed to heighten the stress of the exercise. Then a third figure emerged, this one moving with unmistakable aggression, weapon raised, positioning itself for a clear shot at the structure where her team was supposedly located. Emily didn't hesitate this time. She fired the shot, ringing out clean and true, and the range system confirmed another successful elimination. "Threat neutralized," Willis announced. "Simulation complete." Emily lowered her rifle slowly, her hands finally beginning to tremble now that the adrenaline was starting to fade, her breathing ragged, as the reality of what she just navigated settled over her. She had made the right call, held fire on the ambiguous target, eliminated the confirmed threats. But the tension of those decisions had cost her something, a piece of composure she hadn't realized she'd need to spend. She turned to find Hartigan, Willis, and Nguyen, all watching her with expressions she couldn't quite read, a mixture of professional assessment and something else. Something that looked almost like the beginning of genuine respect. "Sergeant Nguyen," Hartigan said, breaking the silence. "Your assessment." Nguyen stepped forward, her sharp eyes still fixed on Emily. "Textbook restraint on the ambiguous target. Most recruits panic under that kind of time pressure and either fire prematurely or freeze completely. She did neither." She paused. "In my professional opinion, Sergeant, she's ready." Willis nodded in agreement. "Concur. Her judgment under pressure exceeds what I've seen from candidates with twice her experience." All eyes turned to Hartigan, waiting for his final verdict, the one that carried the weight of 30 years of institutional resistance, of a personal wound that had shaped his entire approach to training recruits like Emily. He was quiet for a long moment, studying her face, and Emily forced herself to meet his gaze steadily, refusing to look away despite the exhaustion pulling at every muscle in her body. "Sarah would have been proud," he finally said, his voice rough with emotion he made no effort to hide. "And so am I." Emily felt something release in her chest, a tension she hadn't fully realized she'd been carrying since the moment she'd first stepped onto this base 3 weeks earlier. But even as relief washed over her, Hartigan's expression shifted, something troubled, crossing his weathered features. "There's something else you need to know, Carter," he said, his voice suddenly serious again. "Something that happened last night after you'd gone to sleep. Something that's going to change what happens next for both of us." Emily's stomach tightened with new apprehension. "What is it, Sergeant?" Hartigan glanced at Willis and Nguyen, some silent communication passing between the 3 instructors before he spoke again. "Command received your qualification scores this morning, all of them going back to your original testing. And they're not just interested in you joining advanced sniper training anymore. He paused, choosing his next words carefully. They're talking about something bigger. Something that's going to put you in a position neither of us expected, and one that's going to test you in ways this range never could. Willis cleared his throat and stepped back, giving Hartigan room, but his eyes stayed fixed on Emily like he was watching a verdict about to be read. Gwen folded her arms, her jaw tight, and for a moment nobody said anything at all. The wind picked up across the range, kicking dust along the gravel, and Emily felt her pulse hammering against her ribs, even though the exercise itself was already over. Bigger how? She asked, her voice careful, controlled, though her hands had curled into fists at her sides. Hartigan exhaled slowly like a man about to hand over something heavy. There's a program, he said, classified, joint operation between our command and a special reconnaissance unit. They've been quietly building a female engagement team for close quarters intelligence work in regions where male soldiers can't operate effectively, can't get close to the population, can't gather what needs gathering. He paused. But they need shooters, real shooters. Not just good on paper, good under pressure, good with judgment, good enough to be trusted with decisions most soldiers twice their age never have to make. Emily's throat went dry. And they want me. They want to interview you, Hartigan corrected. Nothing's decided yet, but your scores went up the chain faster than I've ever seen paperwork move in this army, and by the time I got the call this morning, it wasn't a request anymore. It was an order. You report to Colonel Whitfield at 0900 tomorrow. Nguyen spoke up, now her voice sharper than before. Sergeant, with respect, she just finished the hardest qualification exercise this unit has ever run. She hasn't slept. She hasn't eaten a real meal in 2 days. I know that. Hartigan snapped more harshly than he intended, and he caught himself softening his tone when he saw Emily flinch slightly. I know that, Nguyen, but this isn't coming from me. Whitfield doesn't wait for anybody, and if I push back, it draws more attention to her, not less. Trust me, that's the last thing she needs right now. Emily's mind raced, questions colliding faster than she could sort them. What exactly is this unit? What would I be doing? Hartigan's expression darkened, and he glanced once more at Willis, some unspoken understanding passing between the two men. That's classified until you're read in, but I'll tell you this much. He stepped closer, lowering his voice as though the wind itself might carry his words somewhere they shouldn't go. It's dangerous, Carter. More dangerous than anything you've trained for here. This isn't a paper target in a controlled range. This is real people, real consequences, real mistakes that don't come with a do-over. I understand the stakes, Sergeant. Do you? His eyes bored into hers, and for a moment the wall between them, the one that had softened just an hour earlier, out by the tree line, seemed to rebuild itself brick by brick. Because I watched Sarah walk into something she thought she understood, and it cost her everything. I'm not going to stand here and pretend I'm not terrified of watching that happen again. Emily held his gaze, refusing to back down, even as her chest tightened, with something between fear and resolve. Then help me be ready, instead of trying to talk me out of it. Silence stretched between them, heavy and taut, before Hartigan finally gave a short, reluctant nod. Fine, he said. Tonight you and I go over everything Whitfield's people are going to ask you. Every scenario, every trick question. I'm not letting you walk into that room unprepared. He turned to Willis and Nguyen. Dismissed both of you. Good work today. The two instructors exchanged a glance before departing, leaving Hartigan and Emily alone on the range as the sun climbed higher, burning off the last of the morning mist. Emily felt exhaustion pulling at her, a bone-deep fatigue from 2 days without proper rest. But underneath it, something else was stirring, a current of anticipation she hadn't expected to feel this soon after such a grueling test. Get some food in you, Hartigan said, his voice gruff again, though something in it had shifted, some protective instinct, rising to the surface that hadn't been there 3 weeks ago. Mess hall, 30 minutes, then meet me at the briefing room. We've got work to do. Emily nodded, turning to head back toward the barracks, but Hartigan's voice stopped her before she'd taken more than a few steps. Carter, she turned back. You earned this, he said simply. Whatever happens tomorrow, whatever they ask you, you earned the chance to sit in that room. Don't let anybody, including yourself, make you forget that. Emily felt something tighten in her throat and an unexpected wave of emotion catching her off guard after weeks of forcing herself to remain composed under his relentless scrutiny. Thank you, Sergeant, she managed, and then she turned and walked away before he could see how much his words had affected her. The mess hall was quiet at this hour. Most of the other recruits still out on morning duties, and Emily sat alone at a corner table forcing down eggs and toast despite her stomach's protests, her mind racing through everything Hartigan had told her. A classified program, female engagement teams, dangerous work that carried consequences no controlled range could replicate. She thought of her father, of the quiet mornings on their back porch in Montana, of the promise she'd made to herself the day she enlisted that she would never let fear make her decisions for her. Danny found her there a few minutes later, sliding into the seat across from her with a tray of his own, his expression curious. "Heard you pass the final test," he said. "Whole unit's talking about it already. Some kind of ambiguous target scenario." "Something like that," Emily said, managing a tired smile. "You okay? You look like you saw a ghost." She hesitated, unsure how much she was allowed to share, then decided the vague truth was safer than a lie. "There's something else happening, something bigger than the unit. I can't really talk about it yet." Danny's eyebrows rose, but to his credit, he didn't push. "Well, whatever it is, I hope they know what they're getting. Because I've watched you for 3 weeks, Carter, and I've never seen anybody work harder for something in my life." He paused, then added with a grin, "Also, you scared the hell out of half the guys in this unit, so there's that too." Emily laughed despite herself, the tension in her shoulders easing slightly for the first time in hours. "Good, let them stay scared." That evening in the briefing room, Hartigan spread a series of documents across the table, mock interview questions, scenario breakdowns, psychological assessment frameworks he had apparently requested from a contact in the intelligence community earlier that afternoon. His intensity had returned in full force, but this time it was aimed at preparing her rather than breaking her down. "Whitfield's gonna push you," he said, pacing behind the table like he was back on the range. "He's gonna ask about your motivations, your background, your willingness to make decisions in gray areas where there's no clear right answer. He's gonna try to rattle you, see if you crack under direct questioning the way some recruits crack under physical stress." "I can handle questions, Sergeant." "Can you handle this one?" he said, stopping abruptly and fixing her with a hard stare. "If you're given intelligence that could save American lives, but acting on it means a civilian in the area might be caught in the crossfire, what do you do?" Emily's mind raced, running through the ethical weight of the scenario, the impossible calculus of competing harms. "I request additional intelligence to minimize civilian risk before authorizing any action. There's no time. The window's closing in 60 seconds. Then I make the call that protects the most lives possible, and I live with the consequences of that decision, whatever they are." Hartigan studied her for a long moment, something like approval flickering behind his eyes. "Good," he said. "That's the right answer. Not because it's easy, because it's honest. Whitfield doesn't want perfect answers, Carter. He wants honest ones. People who pretend they've got it all figured out are the ones who fold when it actually matters." They continued like this for nearly 2 hours, Hartigan firing question after question at her, scenario after scenario, pushing her to articulate not just what she would do, but why, forcing her to examine her own values under a pressure that felt almost as intense as the qualification exercise itself. By the time they finished, the sky outside had gone fully dark, and Emily felt mentally wrung out in a way that physical exhaustion had never quite matched. "One more thing," Hartigan said as she gathered her things to leave. "Whitfield's going to bring up Sarah." Emily froze. "Why would he bring up someone I've never met?" "Because he was there," Hartigan said, his voice going quiet, almost pained. "Whitfield was my commanding officer during that operation. He's the one who ordered the extraction delay that got her killed." He paused, old grief resurfacing behind his weathered features. "And he's spent 30 years trying to make up for it by building programs that protect soldiers like her better than we protected Sarah. This whole initiative, the one you're interviewing for tomorrow, it exists because of what happened to her." The weight of this revelation settled over Emily, slowly reshaping everything she thought she understood about the stakes of tomorrow's interview. This wasn't just about her career, her potential, her future in the Army. This was about a debt 3 decades old, and a wound that had never fully healed, and a man who was about to look her in the eye and decide whether she represented redemption or the possibility of losing someone else exactly the same way. "Does he know I'm the one applying it?" she asked. "He requested you specifically," Hartigan said, "after seeing your scores." Emily's stomach dropped. Why me? Hardigan hesitated, and something in his expression told her the answer mattered more than he was letting on. Because your shooting profile, he said slowly, your instincts, your decision-making pattern, under the ambiguous target scenario, it's nearly identical to hers. Whitfield saw the after-action report from this morning's exercise, and he called me himself within the hour. Said it was like watching a ghost. The words hit Emily like a physical blow, and for a moment she couldn't speak, caught between the honor of the comparison and the terrifying weight of living up to a legacy that had ended in tragedy. That's not fair, she finally said. To either of us. I'm not her. I can't be her. I told him the same thing, Hardigan said. But Whitfield's not looking for a replacement Carter. He's looking for someone who can finish what she started. Someone who can prove that what happened to Sarah wasn't inevitable, that with the right training, the right support, the right system in place, soldiers like her can succeed instead of becoming a name on a wall. He paused. That's a heavy thing to ask of anybody. And if you walk into that room tomorrow and decide it's too heavy, nobody, not me, not Whitfield, not anybody in that chain of command will think less of you for it. Emily sat in silence for a long moment, absorbing everything, the weight of history and expectation pressing down on her shoulders alongside the physical exhaustion she was still fighting to shake off. Finally, she looked up, her jaw set with the same quiet determination Hardigan had watched carry her through 3 brutal weeks of training. I'm walking into that room tomorrow, she said. Not because I want to be Sarah, but because I want to prove that what happened to her doesn't have to be the end of the story. Hardigan's eyes glistened briefly in the dim light of the briefing room, and he nodded once, a gesture that carried more weight than any words could have. Then get some sleep, Carter. 0900 comes early. But sleep, when it finally came that night, was restless and fragmented, filled with half-formed images of ridgelines and gunfire of a woman she'd never met standing at the edge of her dreams, watching, waiting as though passing something down through the years that only Emily could now carry forward. She woke before her alarm, her heart pounding, the weight of the coming day already pressing down on her chest before she'd even opened her eyes. By 0830, she stood outside the administrative building in her dress uniform, freshly pressed, every button aligned. Her boots polished to a mirror shine, despite the exhaustion still lingering beneath her composed exterior. Hardigan waited beside her, uncharacteristically quiet, his own uniform, immaculate, a folder tucked under his arm that she suspected contained her complete training file, curated carefully to present the strongest possible case. You ready? He asked. No, she admitted honestly, but I'm going in anyway. A ghost of a smile crossed his weathered face. That's the only kind of ready that matters. The door opened, and a young corporal appeared, glancing between them. Colonel Whitfield, we'll see you now. Emily's pulse spiked, adrenaline flooding through her exhausted body as she straightened her shoulders and stepped forward. Hardigan falling into step slightly behind her, close enough to offer silent support without overstepping the formal boundaries of the moment. They moved down a narrow corridor lined with framed photographs of past operations, past decorated soldiers, past a history of service that felt heavier with every step she took toward the office at the end of the hall. The corporal knocked twice, then opened the door, revealing a spacious office dominated by a large wooden desk, behind which sat a broad-shouldered man in his 60s, silver hair cropped close, his uniform decorated with more ribbons than Emily could quickly count, his eyes sharp and assessing the moment they landed on her. Sergeant Hardigan, Colonel Whitfield said, rising slightly from his chair, his voice carrying the kind of authority that came from decades of command. And this must be Private Carter. His eyes lingered on her for a long moment, something complicated passing across his weathered features. You've caused quite a stir with your qualification scores, young lady. Thank you, sir, Emily said carefully, unsure whether it had been intended as a compliment. Sit, Whitfield instructed, gesturing to the chairs positioned in front of his desk. Hardigan and Emily complied, and the colonel studied her in silence for a long moment before speaking again. His voice softer now, tinged with something that sounded almost like grief. You remind me of someone, he said. Someone I failed a long time ago. Emily's chest tightened, but she held his gaze steadily. Sergeant Hardigan told me about Sarah Blackwood, sir. Whitfield's jaw tightened at the name, old pain flickering behind his controlled expression. Did he said quietly, glancing briefly at Hardigan before returning his attention to Emily. Then you understand what's at stake in this interview isn't just your career, Private Carter. It's whether I'm capable of getting this right the second time, or whether I'm about to repeat the exact same mistake that's haunted me for 31 years. He opened a folder on his desk, flipping through several pages before looking up again, his expression hardening into something more formal, more professional. "Let's begin," he said. "And Private Carter, I need you to understand something before we go any further. Everything I'm about to tell you is classified at a level most soldiers never encounter in their entire careers. Once I say it, there's no unhearing it. Are you prepared for that responsibility?" Emily glanced briefly at Hardigan, who gave her the smallest, almost imperceptible nod of encouragement before turning back to face the colonel, directly, her voice steady despite the storm of nerves churning beneath her composed exterior. "Yes, sir," she said. "I am." Whitfield studied her for one final moment, as though searching for any trace of hesitation, any flicker of doubt that might disqualify her before he'd even begun. Finding none, he leaned back in his chair, his expression settling into something between resolve and old unhealed sorrow. "Then let me tell you about Operation Wayfinder," he said, "and why it might just get you killed the same way it got her killed, unless we do this exactly right." Whitfield pulled a single sheet from the folder, sliding it face down across the desk, not yet turning it over. "Operation Wayfinder isn't new," he said. "It's been running in pieces for 6 years quietly under different names, in regions where our male soldiers can search a house but can't search the women and children inside it without causing an international incident. You understand what that means, Private Carter?" "It means intelligence gaps," Emily said. "Blind spots the enemy can hide inside." "Exactly." Whitfield tapped the folder. "Female engagement teams close that gap. They go into villages, into markets, into homes our male soldiers can't enter, and they gather information nobody else can reach. But here's the part nobody puts in the recruiting brochure." His eyes hardened. "They do it without a rifle in their hands most of the time, which means when things go wrong, they go wrong fast, and there's rarely a second chance." Emily kept her voice level. "So why does a program built around not carrying a rifle need me, sir?" Whitfield's mouth tightened into something that wasn't quite a smile. "Because every engagement team needs an Overwatch shooter who can operate independently off the grid, sometimes for days, protecting a team that's deliberately unarmed by design. Someone who can hold a position alone, make split-second calls with no second opinion, and never miss." He finally turned the paper over, revealing a photograph. A young woman in desert fatigues, dark hair pulled back, a rifle slung across her shoulder, squinting into bright sunlight with a half-smile that looked achingly familiar, even though Emily had never seen the woman's face before this moment. "Sarah," Emily said quietly. "Her last photograph," Whitfield confirmed, his voice rough, "taken 4 days before the extraction that killed her." He let the silence sit for a moment, heavy and deliberate. "She was Overwatch for the first engagement team this army ever fielded. Nobody backing her up, nobody relieving her position. We asked her to hold a ridge alone for 6 hours because we didn't have a second qualified shooter to rotate in." His jaw worked silently. "That's not incompetence, Private Carter. That's institutional negligence, and I signed off on it." Hardigan shifted beside her, old anger flickering across his weathered face, though he said nothing, letting the colonel continue. "Wayfinder's redesign fixes that," Whitfield said. 2 shooters per team now, minimum. Rotating Overwatch, real support structure, real extraction protocols, real accountability built into the chain of command instead of soldiers left to improvise when the mission falls apart. He leaned forward. "But redesigning the paperwork doesn't matter if I can't find shooters good enough to fill the roles. And Private Carter, in 6 years of running this program, I have never seen scores like yours." Emily's pulse hammered, the weight of the moment pressing down on her chest. "What exactly would you be asking me to do, sir?" "Deploy," Whitfield said simply, "within 8 weeks after advanced training. Overseas classified location, 12-month rotation, embedded with a 4-person engagement team, operating in hostile territory with minimal support." He paused. "It is without exaggeration one of the most dangerous assignments this army currently runs. I won't sugarcoat that for you. I did that once with Sarah, and I've spent 31 years regretting it." The room fell silent, the weight of history and possibility pressing down on all 3 of them. Emily felt her mind racing through the implications, the danger, the isolation, the responsibility of holding lives in her hands with no one to rely on but her own judgment and skill. But beneath the fear, something else was rising too, something fierce and unshakable that had been building in her since she was 9 years old on her father's back porch. "Sir, may I ask you something?" Emily said. Whitfield nodded. "Go ahead. If I say yes and something happens to me, will it change anything? Will this program actually get better, or will it just become another name added to the wall, another regret you carry for another 30 years? The question landed hard, and Whitfield's composed exterior cracked slightly old grief, and something like respect passing across his features simultaneously. Hartigan's hand tightened almost imperceptibly on the armrest of his chair, and watching the colonel's reaction with an intensity that betrayed how much this moment mattered to him too. "That's the right question to ask," Whitfield said, finally, his voice thick with emotion he made no effort to fully hide. "And I'll give you the honest answer, not the recruiting answer. If something happens to you, it will devastate me personally more than you can possibly understand right now. But it won't be for nothing. Every protocol in this program exists because of what happened to Sarah. Every safeguard, every backup plan, every piece of equipment, upgrade, all of it traces back to her. If, God forbid, something happens to you, the next person who walks through that door will have you to thank for whatever comes next." Emily absorbed this feeling, the enormity of it settled into her bones. This wasn't just a job assignment. It was a legacy she was being asked to either extend or, in the worst case, add another painful chapter to. She glanced at Hartigan, searching his face for any final counsel, any last piece of guidance before she gave her answer. Hartigan met her gaze steadily, and though his eyes carried old fear, they also carried something else: trust earned over 3 brutal weeks of watching her refuse to break. He gave her the smallest nod, silent permission to make this decision entirely her own. "I need to think about it," Emily said, and Whitfield's eyebrows rose slightly. Clearly not the immediate answer he had expected. "Not because I'm scared, sir. I am scared, but that's not why. I need to think about it because a decision this big deserves more than an adrenaline-fueled yes in the middle of an emotional conversation. I want to give you a real answer, not a reactive one." Something shifted in Whitfield's expression, surprise and unmistakable respect. "That," he said slowly, "is exactly the kind of judgment this program needs. You have 48 hours, Private Carter. Take them, talk to whoever you need to talk to, and then come back and give me your real answer." "Thank you, sir." "Dismissed, both of you," Whitfield said, though as Emily rose to leave, he added one final thing, his voice quieter now, almost private. "Private Carter." She turned back. "Whatever you decide, know that you've already done something extraordinary just by sitting in that chair and asking me the question you asked. Most soldiers, male or female, never think to ask it." Emily nodded, unable to trust her voice, and followed Hartigan out of the office and down the corridor, the framed photographs of past operations seeming to watch her differently, now heavier with meaning than they had just 20 minutes earlier. Outside, the midday sun had burned away the morning's clouds, and Hartigan walked beside her in silence for several minutes before finally speaking. "You surprised him in there," he said. "Hell, you surprised me." "I meant what I said," Emily replied. "This isn't a decision I can make on adrenaline." "No," Hartigan agreed. "It's not." He paused, choosing his next words carefully. "For what it's worth, Carter, whatever you decide, you've already proven everything you needed to prove. To me, to Whitfield, to everyone who doubted you walking through that gate 3 weeks ago. Nobody's going to think less of you if you walk away from this." Emily considered this, turning it over in her mind as they walked back toward the barracks. "Would you think less of me, Sergeant, if I said no?" Hartigan stopped walking, turning to face her fully, his weathered features softened by something that looked almost like paternal warmth. "No," he said firmly. "I'd think you made a wise decision to protect your future. But," he hesitated, old grief flickering behind his eyes, "if you said yes, I think I'd finally understand why I couldn't save Sarah. Because I'd get the chance to make sure the next version of her comes home." The weight of his words settled over Emily as they resumed walking the base, bustling around them with the ordinary rhythms of military life, oblivious to the enormous decision unfolding in her mind. She spent the remainder of the day in a strange, suspended state, going through the motions of routine duties, while her thoughts circled endlessly around Whitfield's offer, around Sarah Blackwood's photograph, around the promise she'd made to herself as a child that fear would never make her decisions for her. That evening, she called her father, the phone crackling slightly with the distance between them. his familiar voice grounding her even from thousands of miles away. She told him everything: Hartigan's initial hostility, the truth about Sarah, the qualification exercise, and finally Whitfield's offer, the danger it carried, the weight of the legacy she'd be stepping into. Her father was quiet for a long moment after she finished, and Emily could picture him exactly as he always was during difficult conversations, sitting on the back porch. Rifle cleaning kit probably still spread across the table beside him, staring out at the mountains as he considered his words carefully. "You remember what I told you," he finally said, "the day I gave you that rifle? The day that my worth isn't measured by what others expect of me, but by what I'm willing to endure to prove those expectations wrong." "That's right," he said. "But there's a second part to that I never told you because I didn't think you were ready to hear it yet." He paused. "Sometimes proving people wrong isn't enough. Sometimes you have to decide what you're willing to risk for something bigger than yourself. That's not about proving anything to anybody anymore. That's about who you decide to become." Emily felt tears stinging her eyes, gripping the phone tighter. "What if I fail, Dad? What if I end up like Sarah? Then you'll have died doing something that mattered," her father said gently, surrounded by people who finally built the support system she never had. "But Emily," his voice grew firmer, "I don't think you're going to fail. I've watched you defy every expectation anyone's ever placed on you since you were 9 years old. I don't see any reason that changes now." They talked for another hour, working through every angle of the decision, until Emily finally felt something settle within her, a clarity that had been building beneath the fear and uncertainty since the moment she'd first stepped into Whitfield's office. When she finally hung up the phone, she sat alone in the quiet barracks, staring at nothing, feeling the weight of her decision solidify into something unshakable. The next morning, she found Hartigan at the range running solo drills before the rest of the unit had even woken. He looked up as she approached, reading something in her expression before she'd even spoken a word. "You've decided," he said. "I have." He studied her face for a long moment, searching for any trace of doubt, finding none. "Well," he asked, though something in his tone suggested he already knew the answer. "I'm saying yes," Emily said, her voice steady, resolute. "I'm going to Whitfield's office this morning, and I'm accepting the assignment." Hartigan was silent for a long moment, and Emily watched a complicated mixture of pride and fear pass across his weathered features simultaneously. Finally, he nodded slowly, extending his hand toward her. Not a salute, but something more personal, more human. "Then let's make sure you're the most prepared soldier who's ever walked into that program," he said, gripping her hand firmly. "Because, Carter, I am not losing another one. Not on my watch. Not ever again." But even as they shook hands, sealing her decision, neither of them could have anticipated what awaited her in the weeks ahead. The advanced training that would push her further than anything she'd yet endured. The team she would be embedded with overseas, and a mission that would eventually place her directly in the path of the very danger that had claimed Sarah Blackwood's life 3 decades earlier. Testing not just her marksmanship, but everything she had claimed to believe about courage, sacrifice, and what it truly meant to carry someone else's unfinished legacy into the fire. 6 weeks of advanced training had reshaped Emily into something harder, sharper, more precise than the recruit who had first walked onto Hartigan's range. The classified facility where Whitfield's people conducted final preparation sat tucked into a remote stretch of desert terrain, far from prying eyes, far from anything resembling the comfort of Fort Braddock. Here, the instructors didn't just test marksmanship, they tested everything: her ability to move silently through unfamiliar terrain, her capacity to read a room full of strangers and detect deception, her endurance under interrogation-style questioning designed to simulate capture scenarios that made her stomach twist with genuine fear, even though she knew intellectually that none of it was real. Hartigan had petitioned to remain involved in her preparation, a request Whitfield approved without hesitation, and so he traveled with her to the facility, watching from the sidelines as instructor after instructor pushed her toward her absolute limits. He rarely spoke during these sessions anymore, no longer needing to bark commands or manufacture hostility to test her resolve. Instead, he simply observed, occasionally offering quiet counsel during the rare moments of downtime between exercises. "You're gripping the rifle too tight during the low-light drills," he told her one evening as they sat outside the barracks under a canopy of unfamiliar desert stars. "I've watched you do it 3 nights running. What's going on in your head?" Emily considered the question honestly, turning her canteen over in her hands. "I keep thinking about the deployment, about not having backup the way I do here, about making a call in the dark alone with nobody to check my judgment. That's exactly why you're training here, Hardigan said. So the fear doesn't own you when it actually matters. He paused, but you're right to feel it. Anybody who tells you fear disappears with enough training is lying to you. It doesn't disappear. You just learn to function inside it instead of letting it paralyze you. She absorbed this nodding, slowly filing it away, alongside the dozens of other lessons he'd taught her since that first hostile morning on the training ground. Did Sarah feel it too? The fear. Hardigan was quiet for a long moment. She told me once right before deployment that she was terrified. I remember being surprised because she never showed it. Not once, not in training, not in the field. He stared out at the darkness beyond the barracks. I think that's the mistake I made back then, assuming fearlessness was the goal. It's not. Function despite fear. That's the goal, and you, Carter, you've got that in spades. The final week of training culminated in a full-scale simulated deployment scenario designed to mirror as closely as possible the conditions Emily would face overseas. She was paired for the first time with the 3 women who would become her actual engagement team. Master Sergeant Alicia Ford, a seasoned operator with 12 years of field experience and a sharp, no-nonsense demeanor that immediately commanded respect. Specialist Priya Anand, a linguist fluent in 4 regional dialects with a warmth that balanced Ford's severity, and Corporal Jamie Whitlock, the team's medic, quiet and observant with steady hands that had already saved 2 lives during a previous deployment. So you're the shooter, Ford said, sizing Emily up during their first briefing, her tone assessing rather than hostile. Whitfield's been talking about you for weeks, said your scores broke some kind of record. I've heard a lot about all of you too, Emily replied evenly, looking forward to the working together. Ford's mouth quirked into something that wasn't quite a smile. We'll see how you handle the first live exercise before I decide whether that's true. But there was no malice in the words, only the practical caution of a soldier who had learned the hard way not to trust anybody's reputation until she'd watched them perform under pressure herself. The simulated deployment ran for 4 grueling days, testing not just Emily's shooting, but the team's collective ability to gather intelligence, extract civilians in staged crisis scenarios, and coordinate under conditions designed to simulate genuine hostile territory. On the second night, during a mock engagement that went sideways when the simulation introduced an unexpected complication, a staged ambush nobody had briefed them on in advance, Emily found herself holding Overwatch alone on a ridge while the rest of the team scrambled to extract a simulated civilian informant from a compound under fire. Carter, I've got 2 hostiles converging on the extraction point. Ford's voice crackled through her earpiece, tension audible even through the training scenario. Can you get eyes on them? Emily adjusted her position, scanning through her scope, her heart hammering, despite knowing intellectually that no real bullets would fly tonight. I've got them. 200 meters moving fast, weapons visible. Take the shot if you have a clean line. Emily hesitated for half a second, running the geometry through her mind, calculating angles and backstops with the same instinctive precision that had carried her through Hardigan's brutal qualification exercise weeks earlier. I don't have a clean line without risking the extraction team's position. I need you to shift left, create separation. A tense pause. Copy shifting. The team adjusted, and a moment later, Emily's scope found the clean angle she needed. Lines clear, taking the shot. 2 rounds precisely placed in the simulation registered, both hostiles neutralized. Through her earpiece, she heard Ford's voice tight with the adrenaline of the exercise, but carrying an unmistakable note of respect. Nice work, Carter. Extraction complete. Moving to rally point. When the exercise finally concluded, exhausted and sweat-soaked, despite the cool desert night, the team gathered for debrief, and Ford approached Emily, directly extending her hand for the first time since their initial meeting. You held your position and thought through the geometry instead of just taking the shot you were ordered to take, she said. That's the difference between a shooter who gets people killed and one who keeps them alive. Welcome to the team, Carter. Emily shook her hand, feeling something settle into place. Not just acceptance, but genuine trust, forged through the crucible of shared danger, even simulated danger in a way that no amount of conversation could have replicated. Priya and Jamie offered similar acknowledgments, and for the first time since arriving at the facility, Emily felt the isolating weight of the assignment ease, slightly replaced by the beginning of something that felt almost like family. But that same night after the debrief concluded and the rest of the team had retired to their quarters, Hartigan found Emily still awake sitting outside under the desert stars, her expression troubled, despite the successful exercise. "You did everything right today," he said, settling onto the bench beside her. "Why do you look like you're carrying the weight of the world?" Emily was quiet for the long moment before answering. "During the exercise, when I had to choose between taking a rushed shot or asking Ford to reposition the team, for about half a second I thought about Sarah, about whether hesitation like that was what got her killed." Hartigan's expression tightened, old grief flickering behind his eyes. It wasn't hesitation that killed her, Carter. It was an extraction team that arrived 20 minutes late because of a communication failure nobody anticipated. She held her position exactly as she should have. The system failed her, not her own judgment. "I know that intellectually," Emily said, "but every time I make a call out there, some part of me is going to be measuring it against what happened to her. I don't know if that's a strength or a weakness." Hartigan considered this carefully before answering. "I think," he said slowly, "it's both. It'll make you more careful than most shooters ever bother to be. But you can't let it make you afraid to trust your own training when a decision needs to be fast." He paused. Sarah trusted her training. It just wasn't enough because the system around her failed. This time the system's different. Ford, Priya, Jamie, they're not going to fail you the way that extraction team failed her. And neither am I. Emily absorbed this feeling, some of the tension in her chest loosened slightly. "Are you coming with us? Overseas, I mean?" Hartigan shook his head, regret evident in his weathered features. "No, I'm too old for field deployment now, and Whitfield needs me training the next class back at Braddock, but..." He reached into his jacket and pulled out a small, worn object, pressing it into her palm. Emily looked down to find a tarnished silver compass. Its glass scratched, its casing dented from what looked like decades of use. "This was Sarah's," he said quietly. "Her father gave it to her before her first deployment. I've carried it since the day she died, telling myself I was keeping it safe. But honestly, I think I was just too afraid to let go of it. I want you to have it now." Emily's throat tightened, overwhelmed by the weight of the gesture. "Sergeant, I can't..." "You can," Hartigan interrupted gently, "and you should. Not because I expect you to become her, but because I think she'd want somebody like you carrying a piece of her forward into a mission that exists because of what she gave." He closed her fingers around the compass. "Bring it home, Carter. That's all I ask." 2 weeks later, Emily found herself aboard a military transport aircraft, the compass tucked securely in an inner pocket of her tactical vest, as the plane carried her and her new team toward a classified deployment location that would remain unnamed even in her own communications home. Ford sat across from her, calm and focused, while Priya reviewed regional intelligence briefs and Jamie checked and rechecked her medical supplies with the meticulous care of someone who understood exactly how quickly things could go wrong in the field. "First deployment nerves?" Ford asked, noticing Emily's tightened grip on the armrest as the plane hit a patch of turbulence. "Something like that," Emily admitted. "Good," Ford said. "Anybody who tells you they don't get nervous before a deployment like this is either lying or too reckless to trust. Nerves keep you sharp. Just don't let them keep you frozen." The deployment location, when they finally arrived after a grueling series of transport connections, turned out to be a Ford operating base situated in a mountainous region where the terrain itself seemed hostile, all jagged ridgelines and narrow valleys that could hide threats within 100 different sightlines. Their mission, as briefed by the base commander upon arrival, involved gathering intelligence on a suspected weapons smuggling network operating through a cluster of villages nestled in the surrounding valleys. Work that required exactly the kind of close, careful engagement that male soldiers simply couldn't accomplish without triggering cultural resistance that would shut down cooperation entirely. For the first several weeks, the mission proceeded methodically. Priya and Jamie built relationships within the villages, gathering fragments of information through careful, patient conversation, while Ford coordinated logistics and communication with base command, and Emily rotated between overwatch positions, learning the terrain with the same meticulous precision she'd once applied to memorizing wind patterns on Hartigan's training range. It was during the 5th week that everything began to change. Priya returned from a routine visit to one of the villages with information that immediately elevated the mission's urgency. Intelligence suggesting the smuggling network wasn't merely moving weapons, but coordinating with a larger, more dangerous element, planning an attack against a nearby civilian gathering, scheduled for the following week, an event that would draw hundreds of local families into a single vulnerable location. "We need to move fast," Ford said, gathering the team for an emergency briefing inside their secured operations tent. "Command wants actionable intelligence within 72 hours, or they're pulling in additional forces that could compromise everything we've built into the local population." "I might have a source," Priya offered, though her expression carried visible hesitation. "A woman I've been speaking with, married to one of the men we suspect is involved in the smuggling operation. She's terrified, but I think she wants out. I think she'd talk to us if we can guarantee her safety." "That's a big if," Jamie said quietly. "I know," Priya replied, "but it might be our only real lead." Ford turned to Emily. "If we set up this meeting, I need you on Overwatch. This location's more exposed than anything we've worked before. You comfortable with that?" Emily thought of Hardigan's words back at the training facility, of Sarah's compass tucked against her chest, of the entire weight of legacy and preparation that had brought her to this exact moment. "I'm ready," she said, and she meant it. The meeting was arranged for 2 nights later in a small structure at the edge of the village, chosen specifically for its distance from the main population and the natural cover it provided for Emily's Overwatch position on a ridge roughly 400 meters away. As the team moved into position under cover of darkness, Emily settled into her spot rifle. Steady senses heightened the compass, a small, reassuring weight against her chest as she began her long vigil. The first 2 hours passed without incident, Priya's voice occasionally crackling through the comm system as she worked to establish trust, with the frightened source gently drawing out fragments of information about the planned attack, about routes, about timing, about the identities of the men orchestrating the operation. Emily maintained her position, scanning the terrain methodically, watching for any sign of movement that might indicate the meeting had been compromised. It was nearly 3 hours in when she saw a flicker of movement along a ridge on the opposite side of the valley, too deliberate to be wildlife, too careful to be a casual traveler passing through at this hour. "Ford, I've got a movement," Emily said quietly into her comm, her pulse spiking as she adjusted her scope to track the figure. "Ridge to the northeast, maybe 600 meters from your position. Single individual moving with purpose." "Copy?" Ford's voice came back tight with focus. "Keep eyes on. We're not done here." Emily tracked the figure as it moved with careful precision along the ridgeline, clearly attempting to remain unseen, clearly following a path that would eventually bring it within sight of the meeting location where Priya, Ford, and Jamie were still working to extract crucial intelligence from their frightened source. Her mind raced through possibilities: a scout for the smuggling network, a coincidental traveler, or something far more dangerous. Then a second figure emerged behind the first, and Emily's stomach dropped. "Ford, I've got 2 now," she said, her voice dropping into the flat, controlled tone she'd trained herself to use under pressure. "They're converging on your position from the northeast. I don't think this is a coincidence." Silence for a beat too long, and then Ford's voice returned sharper, now urgent. "Copy. We need another 2 minutes to finish extraction with the source. Can you hold them off without engaging?" Emily's finger found the trigger guard, her breathing controlling itself into the same steady rhythm that had carried her through every test since that first hostile morning at Fort Braddock. "I can hold position," she said, "but if they get within 300 meters of your location, I'm not going to have a choice." "Understood," Ford said. 2 minutes. Hold." The 2 figures continued their advance, moving with a coordinated precision that told Emily these weren't casual observers. This was a deliberate approach, likely triggered by some detail of the meeting that had drawn unwanted attention. She watched them close the distance, meter by meter, her mind calculating angles, backstops, the safety of her own team, below every lesson Hardigan had ever taught her, converging into this single unbearable moment of decision. At 400 meters, the lead figure paused, raising something to their shoulder that made Emily's blood run cold. A weapon. "Ford," she said, her voice dropping to something urgent and unmistakable. "Lead target has a weapon raised. I need an extraction status right now." 30 more seconds. Ford's voice came back strained. "We're moving." Emily's fingers settled onto the trigger, her breathing slowing into the practice rhythm of 100 training exercises. But her mind screamed with the awareness that this wasn't a range, wasn't a simulation, wasn't a controlled exercise with a range officer confirming hits on a distant paper target. This was real. The next decision she made would carry consequences that no training scenario could fully prepare her for. The lead figure's weapon tracked slowly toward the structure where her team was working, and Emily felt the entire weight of Sarah Blackwood's compass pressing against her chest like a held breath, like a question only she could answer in the next 3 seconds. She exhaled slowly, and then from somewhere behind the two advancing figures, a third shape emerged from the darkness. Larger, faster, closing the distance, with an urgency that told Emily this situation had just become far more complicated than a simple two-person threat. And whatever was about to happen next would determine not just whether her team survived the night, but whether everything Hartigan had built toward everything Sarah's memory had been meant to protect against was about to repeat itself in the worst possible way. The third shape moved with a speed and control that immediately told Emily this wasn't another threat joining the first two. It moved differently, lower to the ground, deliberate in a way that read as trained rather than reckless. She adjusted her scope, tracking it for half a second, and her breath caught. "Ford, wait," she said sharply into her comm. Third individual approaching from the south, moving fast, but their posture doesn't match the first two. "I don't think they're together." "Explain," Ford snapped, her voice tight with the pressure of the closing window. "I think they're intercepting," Emily said, watching the figure close the gap on the first two with startling speed. "Whoever this is, they're not converging on your position. They're converging on the other two." Before Ford could respond, Emily watched the scene unfold through her scope with a kind of horrified clarity. The third figure closed the final distance and tackled the lead gunman from behind, driving them both to the ground in a violent tangle of limbs. The second figure spun, weapon rising, and Emily's entire body went taut, her fingers settling against the trigger, with a precision born of every hour she'd ever spent on Hartigan's range. "Second target's about to fire on the first two," she said, her voice flat and controlled despite the chaos screaming through her chest. "I have a shot." "Take it," Ford ordered without hesitation. "Now, Carter." Emily didn't allow herself even a half second of doubt. She exhaled, and the round left her rifle before the thought had even fully finished forming, striking true, and the second figure crumpled instantly to the ground. The echo of the shot rolled across the valley, sharp and unmistakable, and for a moment the entire night seemed to hold its breath. "Target down," Emily reported, already scanning for further threats, her pulse hammering but her hands rock steady. "Ford, what's your status?" "Extraction complete, source secured, moving to rally point now," Ford said, her voice tight but controlled. "Carter, that third individual, I need eyes on them. Who the hell tackled our threat?" Emily adjusted her scope back toward the struggling figures on the ground, watching as the third person finally subdued the first gunman, pinning him with practiced efficiency before rising and looking directly unmistakably toward Emily's position on the ridge, as though they somehow knew exactly where she was hidden. "Ford," Emily said slowly, something cold running down her spine. "I don't think this was a coincidence. I think somebody knew about this meeting before we did." The figure below raised both hands slowly, a universal gesture of non-hostility, and began moving toward the base of Emily's ridge with unhurried, deliberate steps. Emily kept her rifle trained on the approaching figure, every instinct, screaming caution, even as some other quieter part of her mind registered something strangely familiar in the way the stranger moved, controlled, economical, trained in a way that echoed something she recognized but couldn't yet place. "Identify yourself," Emily called out, her voice carrying clearly across the still night air, her finger resting lightly against the trigger guard. The figure stopped roughly 30 meters below her position, hands still raised, and called back in accented but clear English. "My name is Layla Haddad. I work with a coalition intelligence network. I've been tracking this smuggling cell for the past 4 months, and I believe we may have just saved each other's lives tonight." Ford's voice crackled urgently through Emily's earpiece. "Carter, do not stand down until we've confirmed that identity through command. Copy." "Copy," Emily said, though something about the stranger's controlled demeanor, the professional way she'd handled the threat below, told Emily this encounter was about to complicate their mission in ways nobody at the briefing table back at base had anticipated. "Layla, I need you to stay exactly where you are until my team arrives." "Understood," the woman called back, remaining perfectly still, patient in a way that suggested she'd navigated exactly this kind of tense standoff many times before. Within minutes, Ford, Priya, and Jamie arrived at the base of the ridge, weapons ready, the extracted source trembling visibly between them as Priya kept a steadying hand on her shoulder. Emily maintained her overwatch position, tracking the scene below with practiced vigilance, even as Ford began a careful, methodical interrogation of the mysterious woman who had just altered the entire trajectory of their mission. Coalition intelligence, Ford repeated skeptically, studying Layla with a wary assessment of someone who had been burned by false claims before. You have identification to back that up. I have a contact number, Layla said calmly. Call it, ask for Director Reyes. He'll confirm everything I've told you, and he'll tell you something else you need to hear immediately. The attack you've been investigating isn't happening next week. It's happening in 36 hours, and the location has changed. The words landed like a physical blow, and Emily watched from her position above as Ford's controlled expression cracked slightly with the weight of the revelation. That's not what our intelligence indicated, Ford said sharply. Your intelligence is 4 days old, Layla replied, her voice carrying quiet urgency now. Mine is 6 hours old. The cell you've been tracking discovered your source was compromised 2 days ago. They've accelerated everything, moved the target location to the district market instead of the original gathering because it draws a larger, more concentrated crowd. She paused. If we don't move fast in 36 hours, this valley is going to lose a lot more than 400 people to guesswork and outdated intelligence. Ford's jaw tightened, and she glanced up toward Emily's position on the ridge, some silent communication passing between them even across the distance. Carter, hold position. Keep eyes on the perimeter. I'm bringing her in for verification. She turned back to Layla. If you're lying to us, you understand what happens next. I understand perfectly, Layla said, meeting Ford's gaze without flinching. But I'm not lying. I've spent 4 months inside this network's periphery, and I just watched my primary contact die trying to protect information he'd risked everything to gather. I don't have the luxury of lying to you right now. As the team began moving back toward the base, Layla walking calmly between Ford and Priya, while Jamie tended briefly to a shallow cut on her arm sustained during the struggle, Emily finally descended from her overwatch position. Her rifle secured, her mind racing through the sudden acceleration of everything they'd been working toward. When she reached the group, Layla's eyes found her immediately, studying her with an intensity that felt different from the wary assessment she'd given the rest of the team. You're the shooter, Layla said, not a question. That's right, Emily replied cautiously. Something shifted in Layla's expression, a flicker of recognition that Emily couldn't quite place. That shot you took, Layla said quietly, at 400 meters in low light, under pressure with civilians in the surrounding area, that was not an easy shot. I've watched trained snipers hesitate on far less complicated calls. She paused. Where did you train? Fort Braddock, Emily said, under Sergeant Hardigan. Layla went very still, something complicated crossing her features. Cole Hardigan, she said slowly as though testing the name for accuracy. I know that name. Emily's stomach tightened with sudden apprehension. How do you know Sergeant Hardigan? Before Layla could answer, Ford interrupted sharply, redirecting the conversation back toward operational urgency. We can catch up on old acquaintances later. Right now, we have 36 hours to verify this intelligence coordinate with base command and prevent an attack on a market full of civilians. Carter questions later. Right now, I need you back at operations, helping plan overwatch positions for a target location we've never even scouted. Emily forced herself to set aside the strange, unsettling recognition in Layla's expression, following the team back toward their forward operating base as the night sky began its slow transition toward the pale gray of approaching dawn. But the question lingered at the edges of her mind, refusing to be fully dismissed. Even as the team plunged immediately into the frantic work of verifying Layla's claims and restructuring their entire operational plan around a threat that had suddenly become far more immediate and far more dangerous than anything they'd originally prepared for. Back at the operations tent, while Ford worked the secure communications line waiting for confirmation from the Coalition Intelligence Director Layla had named Emily, found herself pulled aside by Jamie, who'd finished treating Layla's minor injuries and was now cleaning her medical kit with methodical focus, though her expression carried visible concern. You okay? Jamie asked quietly. That was your first live engagement out here. I know training prepares you, but nothing really prepares you for the real thing. Emily considered the question honestly, feeling the adrenaline finally beginning to recede, leaving behind a strange, hollow exhaustion. I keep replaying it, she admitted, wondering if there was another way to handle it that didn't end with somebody dying. There wasn't, Jamie said firmly. I watched the whole thing unfold on comms. That target was about to fire on two people, one of whom turned out to be feeding us intelligence that just saved this entire mission. You made the right call, Carter. The only call. I know, Emily said. Intellectually, I know that. It just doesn't feel the way I expected it to feel. Jamie's expression softened with understanding. It's not supposed to feel good, she said. The day it starts feeling good is the day you should worry. What you're feeling right now, the weight of it, the doubt, that's what keeps you human out here. Don't lose that even when it's uncomfortable. Emily nodded, absorbing the wisdom in Jamie's words, though the unease didn't fully dissipate. Across the tent, Ford finally set down the communications handset, her expression a complicated mixture of relief and grim determination. Confirmed, Ford announced to the room. Layla Haddad checks out. Coalition intelligence asset embedded in this region for the past 4 months. Director Reyes vouches for her completely, and he's confirming everything she told us about the accelerated timeline. She paused, glancing toward Layla, who stood quietly near the tent entrance, watching the exchange with careful attention. Which means we have 36 hours to completely restructure our operational plan, coordinate with base command for additional support, and figure out how to protect a market full of civilians from an attack we only just learned is happening. The weight of the timeline settled over the room, and Emily felt the familiar tightening in her chest that had become her body's signal for the beginning of something enormous, something that would test everything she'd learned since that first hostile morning at Fort Braddock. But before the team could fully dive into operational planning, Layla stepped forward, her expression suddenly serious in a way that commanded immediate attention. Before we go further, she said, there's something else you need to know. Something I haven't told your team yet because I needed to confirm it myself first. She glanced directly at Emily, something unreadable passing across her features. The man leading this attack, the one your original intelligence has been tracking as a mid-level smuggling coordinator. He's not who you think he is. I've spent 4 months building a picture of his actual identity, and it connects to something much larger than a simple weapons network. Ford's expression sharpened. Explain. Layla took a slow breath, glancing once more at Emily before continuing. His name is Farid Malouf. 31 years ago, he trained with a paramilitary group that ran operations against American forces in this exact region. And according to records I've spent months piecing together, he was directly involved in an ambush that killed an American soldier, a woman if the details I've gathered are accurate, during a joint operation gone wrong. The room went utterly silent, and Emily felt the blood drain from her face as the pieces began arranging themselves into a shape too terrible to fully comprehend. The compass against her chest, suddenly feeling impossibly heavy, as though it had been waiting 3 decades for exactly this moment to reveal the true weight of what it carried. What was her name? Emily asked, though some part of her already knew the answer before Layla spoke. It already understood that the mission that had brought her to this remote valley, thousands of miles from Hartigan's training range, had just collided directly with the very tragedy that had shaped everything about her journey to this point. Layla's eyes held hers steadily. Sarah Blackwood. The name hung in the air like a physical weight, and for a moment nobody in the tent moved. Nobody breathed the entire operational briefing, suspended in the wake of a revelation none of them had been prepared for. Ford's eyes cut sharply toward Emily, questions written across her face, while Jamie's hand froze mid-motion over her medical kit, and Priya simply stared uncomprehending at the sudden tension that had gripped the room. You knew her? Layla asked, studying Emily's stricken expression with growing understanding. I never met her, Emily said, her voice barely above a whisper, her fingers instinctively rising to touch the outline of the compass beneath her vest. But she trained under the same sergeant who trained me. He carried her memory into every single day of my instruction. He gave me her compass before I deployed. She swallowed hard. The man who killed her is still out there, and he's about to attack a market full of civilians. Ford stepped way forward, her expression hardening into something focused and dangerous. Layla, are you certain about this identification? Absolutely certain. As certain as 4 months of fieldwork and cross-referenced intelligence can make me, Layla said. Malouf has spent 3 decades building influence in this region, moving between smuggling operations and extremist financing, always staying just far enough removed from direct action to avoid accountability. But the attack he's planning now, this is different. Sources tell me he's personally overseeing this operation, which means he's coming out of the shadows for the first time in years. Why now? Priya asked, finally finding her voice. Why risk exposure after 30 years of staying hidden? Layla's expression turned grim, because the market he's targeting sits directly beneath a new coalition surveillance installation scheduled to go operational in exactly 40 hours. Once it's active, his entire operational network in this region becomes exponentially harder to hide. This attack isn't just about civilian casualties. It's a statement and possibly cover for something larger he's planning before that surveillance system comes online. Ford absorbed this, her mind visibly working through the tactical implications. So we're not just preventing an attack, we're potentially disrupting 3 decades of this man's operational infrastructure. If we do this right, Layla confirmed yes. Emily felt the weight of the moment pressing down on her with a gravity she hadn't anticipated feeling this early into her deployment. 3 decades of grief, of institutional failure, of a debt Hartigan and Whitfield had both carried like an open wound, all of it converging on this single impossible window of 36 hours, now shrinking toward 35 as the briefing continued. I need to contact Sergeant Hartigan, Emily said suddenly, surprising even herself with the urgency in her voice. He deserves to know this before anyone else. He's carried this for 31 years. Ford considered this for a moment, then nodded slowly. Make it quick. We don't have time for a long conversation, and everything you say goes through secure channels only. She turned to the rest of the team. The rest of us start restructuring the operational plan. Layla, I need everything you've got on the market layout, likely attack, vectors, and Malouf's known associates in the immediate area. As the team dispersed into focused activity, Emily stepped toward the communication station, her hands trembling slightly as she initiated the secure connection back to Fort Braddock. The line crackled, then connected, and after a tense few seconds, Hartigan's familiar voice came through thick with sleep and immediate concern at the unusual timing of the call. Carter, what's wrong? Emily forced herself to speak steadily, despite the storm of emotion churning beneath her composed exterior. Sergeant, I need you to sit down if you're not already. A paused tension audible even through the static. I'm listening. We identified the man who killed Sarah, Emily said, watching through the tense open flap as the team worked frantically behind her, mapping the market layout across a makeshift table. He's alive, Sergeant. He's been operating in this region for 30 years, and right now he's planning an attack on a civilian market less than 2 days from now. We're the ones who have to stop him. The silence on the other end of the line stretched so long that Emily wondered if the connection had dropped entirely. When Hartigan finally spoke, his voice was rough, unsteady, in a way she'd never heard from him before, not even during the darkest moments of her training. Say his name, Hartigan said quietly. Farid Malouf. Another long silence, and then so quiet Emily almost missed it entirely. Hartigan said, I know that name. I've spent 31 years trying to forget that name, and I know it the second you say it. His breathing had gone ragged, audible even through the static. Carter, listened to me very carefully. This man is dangerous in ways your briefing documents can't fully capture. He's patient, he's brilliant, and he's spent 3 decades learning exactly how American forces think. How we plan, how we hesitate. If you're going up against him, you cannot afford a single mistake. I understand, Sergeant. No, Hartigan said, his voice sharpening with old desperate urgency. I don't think you do, because the operation that killed Sarah, the intelligence failure, the extraction delay, none of that was accidental. We found out years later that Malouf's network had actually anticipated our extraction timeline. He used our own predictability against us. He paused, and Emily could practically hear him gathering himself, forcing composure into his voice. Whatever operational plan your team builds, make sure it accounts for the possibility that he already knows more about your movements than you think he does. Emily's stomach twisted with new apprehension, but she forced herself to respond with the same measured calm Hartigan had always demanded of her during training. I'll make sure Ford knows. Sergeant, I have to go. We don't have much time. Carter. His voice caught thick with emotion he made no effort to hide now. Bring the compass with you when you take the shot. Whatever happens, whatever it costs, finish what Sarah started. And come home. Do you understand me? You come home. I will, Sergeant, Emily said, though even as she spoke the words, some quiet, honest part of her recognized the impossibility of that kind of promise in a situation this volatile. I'll call you when it's over. She ended the connection and returned to the operational table where Ford, Priya, Jamie, and Layla had already begun constructing a detailed picture of the market's layout, marking potential overwatch positions. likely attack vectors and evacuation routes across a hastily assembled map. Emily relayed Hartigan's warning immediately, watching Ford's expression tighten with the new information. If he anticipated an extraction timeline 30 years ago, Ford said slowly, we need to assume he's watching for predictable patterns now too, which means our approach can't follow standard protocol. She looked up at the team. We need something unconventional, something that doesn't match the pattern he'd expect from a coalition response. Layla stepped forward, studying the map with narrowed eyes. The market has 3 primary entry points, she said, tracing her finger across the paper. Standard protocol would position Overwatch at the highest elevation points overlooking each entrance. If Maloof is as sophisticated as Sergeant Hartigan suggests, he'll have people watching those exact positions, waiting to identify and neutralize any coalition Overwatch before the attack even begins. So we don't use the high ground, Ford said, working through the implications. We use unconventional positioning, Emily said, suddenly an idea forming rapidly in her mind. What if Overwatch isn't elevated at all? What if I'm positioned at street level, disguised within the market crowd itself, close enough to react instantly, but invisible within the pattern he's expecting? The team fell silent, considering the audacity of the suggestion. Ford's eyes narrowed thoughtfully. That's incredibly risky, Carter. Street-level positioning means no defensive elevation, no clear sight lines, and if things go wrong, you're caught directly in the crowd with civilians all around you. I know, Emily said, but if Maloof's expecting elevated Overwatch and we give him exactly that expectation while I'm actually operating from an unexpected position, we might be able to identify and neutralize the threat before he even realizes his plan's been compromised. Layla studied Emily with renewed interest. That's actually brilliant. Dangerous but brilliant. It plays directly against the pattern recognition he's built his entire operational strategy around. Ford considered the plan for a long, tense moment, weighing the risks against the potential benefit before finally nodding slowly. We'll need a decoy Overwatch position, something visible enough to draw his attention, while Carter operates from the unexpected angle. She turned to Priya. Can your contact inside the village help us establish a visible false position without exposing our real strategy? I can try, Priya said, but it means trusting someone we've only known for a few hours, someone with everything to lose if this goes wrong. We don't have another option, Ford said grimly. We have less than 34 hours. As the team continued refining the operational plan late into the night, Emily found herself pulled aside once more by Layla, who studied her with an expression that carried something beyond mere professional assessment, something that looked almost like recognition, like she was seeing a reflection of someone she'd once known. You remind me of her, Layla said quietly once they'd stepped away from the immediate activity of the planning table. Sarah, I never met her, but I've read the after-action reports from that operation more times than I can count, trying to understand what happened, trying to understand the man who did it. She paused. The way you think through problems, the way you refuse to accept the obvious solution when a better one exists, that's exactly the pattern described in those old reports. Emily absorbed this feeling, the weight of comparison settled over her once again, though this time it carried less fear and more quiet resolve. I'm not trying to be her, she said, but I understand why people keep seeing her in me. I think I've decided that's not something to run from anymore. Good, Layla said, because tomorrow you're going to need every bit of that instinct, that unconventional thinking, if we're going to pull this off without losing anyone in that market. The following day passed in a blur of frantic preparation, the team working with barely any sleep to finalize logistics, coordinate with base command for emergency backup, and rehearse contingency plans for every conceivable way the operation might unravel. Emily spent hours studying the market layout until she could navigate it blindfolded in her mind, memorizing entry points, sight lines, potential hiding spots, and escape routes with the same relentless precision she'd once applied to memorizing wind patterns on Hartigan's training range. As evening approached with less than 12 hours remaining before the attack's projected timeline, Ford gathered the team for a final briefing, her expression carrying the weight of command responsibility that came with sending people into genuine, unpredictable danger. I want to be honest with all of you, Ford said, her voice steady despite the gravity of the moment. This plan carries significant risk. Carter's positioning puts her directly in harm's way with minimal defensive cover. Priya and Jamie will be embedded within the market crowd, gathering real-time intelligence, and prepared to assist with civilian evacuation if things go wrong. And Layla, she glanced toward the intelligence operative who had within 24 hours become an indispensable part of their operational planning. Layla's putting her cover and possibly her life on the line by helping coordinate our decoy positioning through her local contacts. I understand the risk, Layla said simply. This isn't the first time I've made that trade. None of us are taking this lightly, Ford continued. But if we succeed, we prevent an attack that could kill hundreds of civilians, and we potentially disrupt a criminal network that's operated with impunity in this region for 3 decades. She looked around at each member of the team. Any final questions or concerns need to be raised now. Once we move into position tomorrow, there's no room for hesitation. Nobody spoke the weight of shared purpose settling over the group like a physical presence. Finally, Emily broke the silence, her voice carrying quiet determination. I have one request. If everything goes according to plan and we identify Maloof directly, I want confirmation before any shot is taken. Not because I doubt the intelligence, but because I promised myself a long time ago that I'd never let assumption replace verification, no matter how emotionally invested I might be in a particular outcome. Ford nodded approvingly. Agreed. Confirmed identification only. No assumption-based engagement, regardless of how personal this has become for any of us. Her eyes lingered on Emily for a moment longer, something like respect passing across her features. That's good instinct, Carter. Don't lose it tomorrow, no matter what happens. That night, unable to sleep despite the exhaustion weighing on every muscle in her body, Emily sat alone outside the operations tent, the compass in her palm catching faint moonlight as she turned it over, slowly tracing the scratches and dents that marked 3 decades of history she was now inextricably woven into. Footsteps approached, and she looked up to find Layla settling onto the ground beside her, her own expression thoughtful in the darkness. Can't sleep either, Layla asked. No, Emily admitted. Too much running through my head. Layla was quiet for a moment, studying the compass in Emily's hands. May I ask you something personal? Go ahead. Are you doing this for yourself? Layla asked carefully. Or are you doing this to finish something that isn't actually yours to finish? The question landed with unexpected weight, and Emily considered it seriously before answering, turning the compass over one final time before closing her fingers around it. I think, she said slowly, it started as both. I think Sergeant Hardigan's grief became something I carried alongside my own ambition, without fully realizing where one ended and the other began. She paused. But somewhere between that qualification exercise and this exact moment sitting here with you, it stopped being about finishing Sarah's story. It became about writing my own on my own terms, even if her story is the reason I ended up here in the first place. Layla nodded slowly, something like approval in her expression. That's the right answer, she said. The soldiers who get themselves killed out here are usually the ones still fighting somebody else's war inside their own head. You sound like you've made peace with which war is actually yours. I hope so, Emily said quietly. Tomorrow's going to test that theory pretty thoroughly. Layla offered a faint, tired smile. Tomorrow tests all of our theories, Carter. That's the nature of this work. She rose to her feet, brushing dust from her clothing. Get some rest if you can. Even an hour helps more than you'd think. But rest, when it finally came in fragments, throughout the remaining hours of darkness, offered little comfort-filled. Instead, with restless anticipation of the impossible day ahead, a day that would require Emily to walk directly into a crowded market, invisible within the chaos of ordinary life, carrying the weight of a decision that could either finally close the wound Hardigan had carried for 3 decades or add a devastating new chapter to a tragedy that had already cost far too much. By the time the pale light of dawn began creeping over the mountainous horizon, Emily was already awake, dressed in unremarkable local clothing that would allow her to blend seamlessly into the market crowd, her weapon concealed, but accessible the compass tucked securely against her chest, where it had remained since the night Hardigan first placed it in her palm. Ford conducted one final equipment check, her expression carrying the controlled intensity of a commander sending her team into the most consequential operation any of them had yet faced. "Come check," Ford said, and one by one the team confirmed their communication systems were functioning properly, voices steady despite the tension coiling through every member of the group. "Remember the plan," Ford continued. Priya and Jamie embed within the crowd near the eastern entrance, gathering real-time observation and ready to assist evacuation if needed. Layla coordinates with her local contact to maintain the decoy overwatch position, visible from the market's northern approach. Carter. She turned to Emily, her expression softening slightly despite the gravity of the moment. You're the variable Maloof isn't expecting. Trust your training, trust your instincts, and remember confirmed identification before any engagement. No exceptions. Understood, Emily said, her voice steady despite the storm churning beneath her calm exterior. As the team dispersed toward their designated positions, moving separately through the pre-dawn streets to avoid drawing attention, Emily felt the compass shift slightly against her chest, with each step a constant grounding reminder of everything riding on the next several hours. The market was already beginning to stir with early activity as she approached vendors setting up stalls, the first trickle of morning shoppers beginning to move through the narrow pathways between makeshift stands selling produce, textiles, and household goods. She moved through this gathering crowd with practiced casualness, her senses heightened despite her outwardly relaxed posture, cataloging exits, potential threats, and defensive positions with the same meticulous attention she'd once applied to memorizing terrain on Hardigan's training range. Through her earpiece hidden beneath a scarf wrapped loosely around her head, she could hear the quiet murmur of her team's coordination. Priya's voice calm and measured, providing updates on crowd density and movement patterns. Jamie's occasional confirmation of medical readiness. Ford's steady oversight from the mobile command position established a safe distance away. 2 hours passed with agonizing slowness, the market filling gradually with the ordinary rhythms of daily commerce, entirely unaware of the danger that intelligence suggested was converging on this exact location. Emily maintained her position near the market's center, appearing to browse a stall, selling woven textiles while her attention remained fixed on the surrounding crowd, watching for any sign of the coordinated movement that would indicate Maloof's forces beginning their approach. It was nearly midday when Priya's voice crackled through the comm system with sudden, unmistakable urgency. I've got unusual movement near the eastern entrance. 3 individuals moving with deliberate coordination, no obvious purchases, scanning the crowd rather than the merchandise. Emily's pulse spiked, every instinct sharpening instantly into focused alertness. Copy, she said quietly, adjusting her position to gain a better sightline toward the eastern entrance, while maintaining her cover within the crowd. Ford, are you seeing this on the overhead feed? Confirmed. Ford's voice came back tight with focus. 3 individuals matching Priya's description, continuing to monitor for additional movement. Minutes stretched into an agonizing eternity as the team tracked the suspicious individual's slow, methodical progress through the market, watching for any sign that would confirm hostile intent versus simple coincidence. Then through a gap in the crowd, Emily caught sight of a 4th figure entering from the northern approach, older, moving with unhurried confidence, wearing clothing that marked him as someone of local authority or respect rather than an obvious threat. Something about his posture, his measured pace, the way the 3 individuals near the eastern entrance subtly adjusted their positioning in apparent response to his arrival sent a jolt of certainty through Emily's chest. Ford, she said quietly, her voice dropping into the flat, controlled register she reserved for moments of absolute focus. I think I have eyes on our primary target. Northern approach male, approximately 60 years old, moving with what looks like command authority over the 3 individuals near the eastern entrance. Can you get a clearer visual confirmation? Ford asked immediately. Emily shifted her position carefully, weaving through the crowd with unhurried casualness, despite the adrenaline hammering through her veins, working to gain a clearer angle on the approaching figure. As she moved, Layla's voice suddenly cut through the comm system, tight with unmistakable alarm. That's him, Layla said, her voice carrying a controlled fury that betrayed just how personal this moment had become for her too. That's Maloof. I'd recognize him anywhere, even after everything I've only seen in surveillance photographs. Carter, that's your confirmed target. Emily's entire body went taut with focused intensity. Every lesson Hardigan had ever taught her, every hour of training, every moment of preparation converging into the single unbearable point of decision. She reached for the compass beneath her clothing, feeling its familiar weight against her palm, and began moving carefully through the crowd toward a position that would give her the clean, confirmed shot the entire mission had been building toward. But even as she moved, something in the crowd's behavior shifted, a subtle ripple of awareness passing through the 3 individuals near the eastern entrance, their postures suddenly tensing in a way that told Emily with sickening certainty that somehow impossibly their cover had just been compromised. The ripple of awareness spread fast, too fast, and Emily felt her stomach drop as she watched one of the three men near the eastern entrance turn his head sharply toward Priya's position, his hand drifting toward his waistband with unmistakable intent. "Priya, you've been made," Emily said into her comm, her voice dropping to a razor-sharp whisper, even as she kept moving through the crowd, closing the distance toward Maloof with careful, unhurried steps that betrayed none of the urgency screaming through her body. "Get clear now." "Copy moving." Priya's voice came back tight with controlled fear, and Emily heard the faint shuffle of fabric and footsteps as her teammate began working her way out of the immediate danger zone, still trying to maintain the appearance of an ordinary shopper, despite the adrenaline that must have been roaring through her veins. "Ford talked to me," Emily said. "What tipped them off?" "Unknown." Ford's voice came back clipped and urgent. "Could be nothing, could be everything. Carter, you are still cleared for confirmed target engagement, but I need you to move fast before this whole situation collapses into chaos." Emily's eyes stayed locked on Maloof as he continued his unhurried progress through the market, seemingly unaware or perhaps supremely confident that anything had shifted around him. She calculated the distance, the angle, the density of the crowd between them, every variable converging into the kind of split-second tactical assessment that Hartigan had drilled into her across weeks of merciless training. 40 meters. Too far, too many bodies between them for a clean shot, even if she'd had her rifle drawn, which she didn't. This entire operation had been built around close engagement, a concealed sidearm tucked against her hip beneath the loose fabric of her clothing, a weapon meant for confirmation. Range use only, not the kind of precision distance work she'd trained for on Hartigan's range. "I need him closer," Emily murmured, almost to herself, though Ford caught it through the comm. "Copy, work the angle. We've got maybe 90 seconds before this situation fully deteriorates." Emily adjusted her path through the crowd, moving with deliberate casualness toward a narrow gap between two market stalls that would intersect naturally with Maloof's current trajectory, her mind racing through contingencies even as her outward posture remained relaxed, unremarkable, invisible within the ordinary chaos of market commerce. She was 15 meters away when the second of the three eastern entrance men suddenly broke into a run, shouting something in rapid dialect that sent a visible wave of panic rippling through the nearby crowd. Chaos erupted instantly. Vendors scrambled to protect their stalls, shoppers screamed and scattered in confused competing directions, and in the sudden pandemonium, Emily watched Maloof's expression shift recognition, then alarm, then the cold calculating look of a man who had survived 30 years of danger by never hesitating when his instincts screamed warning. He turned to run. "He's moving," Emily said sharply into her comm, already breaking into pursuit despite the surging crowd threatening to swallow him from view entirely. "Ford, I'm losing him in the chaos." "Jamie, get eyes on civilian safety priority now," Ford ordered, her voice cutting through the comm with commanding urgency. "Layla, can your contact create a choke point at the southern exit?" "Working on it," Layla's voice came back breathless, already moving. Emily pushed through the panicked crowd, her earlier careful invisibility abandoned now, in favor of speed tracking Maloof's fleeing form as he shoved his way toward a narrow alley branching off from the main market thoroughfare. She caught brief fragmented glimpses of him through the chaos, a flash of gray hair, the dark fabric of his jacket, the unmistakable urgency of a man who understood exactly how much danger he was suddenly in. She reached the alley entrance, seconds behind him, her hand finally closing around the grip of her concealed weapon as she rounded the corner into a narrower, quieter passage between two buildings, the roar of the market's panic fading slightly behind her. Maloof stood 20 meters ahead, breathing hard, one hand braced against the wall, the other reaching into his jacket with a speed that sent every alarm bell in Emily's training screaming at once. "Don't," Emily said sharply. Her weapon raised her voice, carrying the flat, unshakable authority of someone who had trained for exactly this moment across months of preparation. "Hands where I can see them." Maloof froze his hand still partially inside his jacket, his eyes finding hers across the narrow distance with an expression of calculating assessment that sent a cold chill down her spine. "American," he said, his accented voice carrying quiet, dangerous amusement despite his precarious position. "Young, they've gotten desperate sending someone so young." "Hands now," Emily repeated, her aim steady despite the pounding of her own heart. Slowly, deliberately, Maloof withdrew his hand from his jacket, revealing empty fingers, and raised both hands to shoulder height, though his expression remained infuriatingly calm, almost amused. "You're going to shoot an unarmed man in an alley," he said. "That will look very good in your after-action report." "You're not unarmed," Emily said. "You're just currently not holding a weapon. There's a difference, and we both know it." She kept her stance wide stable, her weapon never wavering. "Farid Maloof, on the ground, hands behind your head." Something shifted in his expression at the sound of his own name, a flicker of genuine surprise beneath the practiced calm. "You know who I am," he said slowly. "I know exactly who you are," Emily said. And for the first time since entering the alley, her voice carried an edge of something beyond professional detachment. Something raw, something personal, something that had been building since the night Hartigan first pressed Sarah's compass into her palm. "I know what you did 31 years ago. I know the name of the woman you killed." Maloof's eyes narrowed, studying her with new sharpened interest. "Blackwood?" he said quietly, testing the name like he was recalling something from very far away. "That was a long time ago, a different war, different circumstances." He paused. "Is that what this is? Some kind of personal vendetta? 31 years delayed?" "This is justice," Emily said. "Delayed maybe, but not denied." Maloof's expression shifted again, something calculating moving behind his eyes as he studied her stance, her grip, the way she held herself with the unmistakable bearing of someone extensively trained. "You remind me of her," he said slowly. "The way you hold that weapon. The way you're not shaking despite everything happening around us." He tilted his head slightly. "Did they train you specifically to remind me of her? Is that the strategy? Some kind of psychological unraveling before the real interrogation begins?" "Nobody trained me to be anything but the best version of myself," Emily said, refusing to let his words shake her composure, though something in his observation landed with uncomfortable precision. "Get on the ground. This is your last warning." For a long moment, Maloof remained standing, his eyes calculating, his body coiled with the tension of a man weighing his remaining options. Then, almost imperceptibly, Emily caught a flicker of movement behind him, a second figure emerging from a doorway further down the alley, weapon already raised, angling for a shot that would catch her completely from the side. "Behind you!" Emily's own instincts screamed the warning, even as she recognized with sickening clarity that the warning wasn't for Maloof at all. It was her own vulnerability being exploited, a coordinated ambush she'd walked directly into. She dropped low and spun in a single fluid motion, years of training collapsing into pure reflexive action as she registered the second gunman's weapon tracking toward her position. Her own shot fired first, striking true, even from the awkward defensive angle, and the second attacker crumpled against the alley wall with a strangled cry. But the half-second of distraction had cost her. When she turned back toward Maloof's original position, he was gone, vanished into a side passage she hadn't accounted for, and Emily's heart hammered with furious, desperate urgency as she realized the man responsible for Sarah's death, the man her entire mission had converged towards stopping, had just slipped through her fingers in the chaos of the ambush. "Ford, I lost him!" she said into her comm, her voice tight with frustration and adrenaline, already moving toward the side passage in pursuit. "Second shooter down, but Maloof's gone. I'm in pursuit alley system east of the main market." "Copy, I'm rerouting Layla's contact to cut off potential exit points." Ford's voice came back controlled despite the mounting chaos. "Carter, be careful. If there was one ambush, there could be more." Emily moved through the narrow passage with careful urgency, her weapon ready, every sense heightened to catch the slightest indication of further threat. The alley opened into a small courtyard, empty except for scattered debris and the distant muffled roar of the market's continuing panic beyond the surrounding walls. She scanned the space quickly, finding no immediate sign of Maloof, though 3 separate passages branched off from the courtyard in different directions, offering countless possibilities for his escape. Her earpiece crackled. "Carter," Layla's voice breathless and urgent. "My contact spotted a man matching Maloof's description, moving toward the southern warehouse district. If he reaches that area, he has access to at least 4 vehicles and multiple escape routes we won't be able to cover in time." "How far?" Emily asked, already moving toward the southernmost passage. "Maybe 3 minutes ahead of you if you move fast." Emily broke into a full run, pushing her body past the exhaustion of the morning's tension, every ounce of training and determination channeling into the desperate pursuit. As she ran, fragmented thoughts collided in her mind, Hardigan's voice telling her to bring the compass when she took the shot, Whitfield's grief-worn face describing 31 years of regret, Sarah Blackwood's photograph, young and smiling, captured just days before her death. She would not let this end in another failure, not after everything that had led her to this exact moment. The passage opened onto a wider street bordering the warehouse district, and Emily caught sight of Malouf's fleeing form nearly 100 meters ahead, moving with the desperate speed of a man who understood exactly how much danger he remained in. She raised her weapon, calculating the shot, the angle, the safety of the surrounding area, every lesson from Hardigan's range converging into split-second tactical assessment. But something stopped her. Confirmed identification before engagement. No exception. Ford's words echoed in her mind, and though she had visual confirmation, though she'd spoken directly with him in the alley, some deeper instinct held her finger from the trigger. Some final aching desire to see this end, not with a bullet in his back, but with the full weight of justice Sarah had never received. "Malouf, stop!" she shouted, closing the distance with relentless pursuit. "There's nowhere left to run." He didn't stop. If anything, his pace increased, desperation driving him toward the warehouse district's promise of escape. Emily pushed harder, her lungs burning, her legs screaming with exhaustion, refusing to let 3 decades of grief slip away into the chaos of a failed pursuit. Then from a side street ahead of Malouf's path, a figure emerged, suddenly blocking his route. With calm, deliberate positioning, Layla Weapon raised her expression, carrying the same fierce determination that had first drawn Emily's attention back on that dangerous ridge days earlier. "It's over, Malouf," Layla called out, her voice carrying clearly across the narrowing distance. 4 months of surveillance, 31 years of evasion, it ends today. Malouf skidded to a stop, trapped now between Layla's blocked path ahead and Emily's closing pursuit from behind, his expression cycling rapidly through calculation, desperation, and finally something that looked and almost like resignation. "You won't shoot me," he said, though his voice carried less confidence, now less of the calm amusement from the alley. "Not after everything your command has drilled into you about restraint, about confirmed engagement protocols." "You're right," Emily said, closing the final distance, her weapon steady despite her ragged breathing. "I'm not going to shoot you. You're going to face justice for what you did to Sarah Blackwood and for everyone else you've hurt across 31 years of hiding in the shadows." She paused, the compass against her chest, feeling impossibly heavy, impossibly significant in this exact moment. "Get on the ground, now." For a long, tense moment, Malouf remained standing, weighing his final dwindling options, his eyes flicking between Emily and Layla with the calculating desperation of a man who had never once in 3 decades faced a situation he couldn't manipulate his way out of. Then slowly his shoulders sagged and he lowered himself to the ground. Hands raised, the fight finally draining out of him as the reality of his capture settled in. Emily secured his hands with practiced efficiency, her own heart still hammering with the aftermath of the chase, the weight of the moment only beginning to fully register as Ford's voice crackled through her earpiece with unmistakable relief. "Carter report. Target secured." Emily said, her voice thick with an emotion she couldn't fully name. Exhaustion, vindication, grief, and something that felt almost like closure. Though she understood, even in this moment of triumph, that the true resolution of everything Sarah's memory represented was still not fully complete. But as Layla moved to assist with Malouf's restraint, her expression suddenly shifted, her eyes catching something in the distance that made her go rigidly alert. "Carter," she said quietly, urgently, "we have a problem. Look toward the warehouse rooftop, northeast corner." Emily followed her gaze, and her blood ran cold at what she saw silhouetted against the midday sun, a second team previously unaccounted for moving into position with weapons raised, clearly prepared to ensure that whatever happened to Malouf, this operation would not end in his peaceful capture. Emily's entire body snapped into focused action the instant she registered the shapes on the rooftop, her training overriding the exhaustion still burning through her muscles from the pursuit. "Ford, we've got a second team, warehouse rooftop, northeast corner, minimum 3 shooters," she said into her comm, already grabbing Malouf by the collar and hauling him toward the meager cover of a nearby loading dock. This wasn't just him running. This was a trap. "Copy, redirecting all available support to your position." Ford's voice came back tight with alarm. "Carter, Layla, get to cover now." Layla was already moving, diving behind a stack of shipping containers as the first shots rang out from the rooftop, chips of concrete, exploding from the ground where she'd been standing only a second earlier. Emily dragged Maloof down behind the loading dock's low concrete wall, her own weapon still trained on him, even as bullets began chewing into the structure around them. "You set this up," Emily said through gritted teeth, staring at Maloof's suddenly triumphant expression. "You knew we were coming. This whole thing, the market, the flight into the alley, it was designed to draw us into exactly this position. Your Sergeant Hartigan taught you to read tactical patterns." Maloof said, his voice carrying dark satisfaction, despite his restrained hands and the gunfire erupting around them. "I taught myself to read soldiers. Predictable. Emotional. So determined to close old wounds that you walk directly into new ones." Emily's jaw tightened, refusing to let his words shake her focus, even as another volley of gunfire forced her lower behind the concrete barrier. Layla status. "Pinned but unhurt." Layla called back from her position behind the shipping containers, her own weapon returning fire in controlled, measured bursts toward the rooftop. "3 shooters confirmed, possibly a 4th I can't get eyes on. We need extraction or reinforcement fast." "Ford, we need that support now," Emily said urgently, ducking as another round sparked off the concrete inches from her head. "2 minutes out." Ford's voice came back strained. "Jamie's coordinating with local security forces, but Carter, you and Layla need to hold that position." 2 minutes. It felt like an impossible eternity, with rounds still cracking against their cover, with Maloof's restrained form squirming beside her, testing the strength of his bindings with the desperate energy of a man who understood his rescue attempt might actually succeed if his men could hold their position long enough. "You'll die here," Maloof said, his voice low, almost conversational despite the chaos. "Just like she did, trapped, outnumbered, waiting for help that arrives too late." Something in Emily snapped taut at the comparison, old grief and fresh determination fusing into something unshakable. "Sarah died because a system failed her," she said, her voice hard as stone. "I'm not her. And this isn't 31 years ago. I've got backup coming. I've got a team that doesn't leave people behind, and I've got exactly the training I need to survive this." She risked a glance over the concrete barrier, tracking the rooftop shooters' positions through quick, calculated glimpses, her mind working through angles and timing with the same relentless precision Hartigan had drilled into her across weeks of merciless instruction. One shooter had shifted position to gain a better angle on Layla's cover. Another remained fixed near the rooftop's edge, clearly serving as the primary overwatch for the ambush. "Layla, on my mark, I need you to draw their attention toward your position," Emily called out. "I'm going to flank left, use the loading dock structure for cover, and take the primary shooter." "That's insanely risky," Layla called back, though Emily could hear the calculation already running behind her voice. "You'll be exposed for at least 4 seconds, crossing that open ground." "I know," Emily said. "But if we stay pinned here, Ford's reinforcements arrive to find us already dead. I'd rather take the risk than wait for a rescue that might come too late." A tense pause, and then Layla's voice resigned but resolute. "On your mark." Emily counted down silently, gathering every ounce of focus and courage she'd built across months of relentless training, the compass against her chest feeling like a physical anchor grounding her in this exact terrifying moment. Now. Layla surged from cover, her weapon firing in controlled bursts towards the rooftop, drawing immediate concentrated fire from 2 of the 3 visible shooters. Emily broke from behind the loading dock simultaneously, sprinting across the exposed ground, with every muscle screaming, bullets cracking past her with terrifying proximity as she dove behind a stack of wooden pallets that offered marginal but crucial cover. She came up, firing her weapon, finding the primary shooter's position with the same instinctive precision that had carried her through Hartigan's brutal qualification exercise weeks earlier, through the ambiguous target scenario, through every test that had brought her to this exact impossible moment. Her shot struck true, and the primary shooter crumpled backward, disappearing from the rooftop's edge. "One down," Emily called out, already tracking toward the second visible shooter, who had turned his attention from Layla toward Emily's newly exposed position. The remaining rooftop gunmen redirected their fire toward her rounds, splintering the wooden pallets inches from her head, and Emily pressed herself lower, calculating her next move with desperate urgency. Behind her near the loading dock, Maloof continued struggling against his restraints, and with sickening realization, Emily understood that if he managed to free himself during this chaos, everything they'd fought to achieve would collapse into failure. "Layla, can you cover Maloof?" she called out. "He's working his hands free." On it, Layla responded, and Emily caught a glimpse of her repositioning to maintain a clear line toward the restrained man while continuing to return fire toward the rooftop. The distant wail of approaching vehicles finally reached Emily's ears, and relief flooded through her chest, even as she remained pinned behind the splintering pallets, still exchanging fire with the remaining shooters above. "Ford, I hear you coming," she called into her comm. "We've got 2 shooters, still active, rooftop position, northeast corner. 30 seconds out," Ford's voice came back. "Hold position, Carter." 30 seconds stretched into an agonizing eternity, each second marked by the sharp crack of gunfire, the desperate calculation of angles and cover, the relentless awareness that a single mistake could end everything. Then finally the roar of approaching vehicles crescendoed into arrival, and Emily heard the unmistakable sound of reinforcement forces deploying rapidly, weapons trained toward the rooftop position that had pinned them down for what felt like an eternity, but had actually been mere minutes. The remaining gunmen, recognizing the shifted balance of force, broke and fled across the rooftop, disappearing from view as Ford's reinforcement team secured the perimeter with practiced efficiency. Emily rose slowly from behind the shattered pallets, her body trembling with adrenaline finally beginning to recede, her eyes immediately searching for Layla's position. "You good?" Emily called out. "I'm good," Layla confirmed, emerging from behind the shipping containers, her weapon still trained on Maloof, who remained secured near the loading dock, his earlier triumph replaced now by grim, resigned defeat. He's still contained. Rescue attempt failed. Ford appeared moments later, moving with the controlled urgency of someone who had spent the last several minutes coordinating a desperate response from a distance, her expression flooding with relief as she took in the scene before her. "Report," she said, though her eyes lingered on Emily with unmistakable concern. "Target secured, ambush neutralized, 1 hostile down. Remaining forces fled the scene." Emily said, her voice steadier than she felt exhaustion and adrenaline warring within her chest. "Layla and I are both uninjured." Ford's shoulders sagged slightly with relief, and she stepped forward, gripping Emily's shoulder firmly. "That flanking maneuver was reckless as hell, Carter. It was also exactly the kind of unconventional thinking that saved both your lives." She paused. "Good work, both of you." As local security forces moved in to take custody of Maloof, his expression finally cracking into something resembling genuine defeat as the reality of his capture settled over him, Emily found herself standing quietly beside Layla, watching the culmination of everything that had brought her to this exact impossible moment. 31 years of grief, of institutional failure, of a wound that had shaped Hartigan's entire career, and Whitfield's every decision, since all of it converging into this single hard-won victory. "You did it?" Layla said quietly, studying Emily's exhausted but resolute expression. "You actually did it." "We did it," Emily corrected. "All of us. You most of all. 4 months of work that made this possible." Layla offered a tired, genuine smile. "I think Sarah would be proud of what you just did out here." Emily reached up instinctively, touching the outline of the compass beneath her clothing, feeling its familiar weight settle into something that felt, for the first time since Hartigan had first pressed it into her palm, like closure rather than burden. "I hope so," she said quietly. "I really hope so." The following hours passed in a blur of operational debrief, medical evaluation, and the methodical process of securing Maloof for transport to a secure facility where he would finally face accountability for 3 decades of hidden crimes. Emily moved through it all in a state of exhausted, disbelieving relief, the adrenaline of the day's events slowly draining away to leave behind a bone-deep fatigue that no amount of training could have fully prepared her for. That evening, back at the forward operating base, as the team gathered for a quiet debrief before the exhaustion of the day finally claimed them all, Ford raised a small toast with whatever makeshift beverages the base could provide, her expression carrying genuine warmth despite the gravity of everything they'd just accomplished. "To a mission that started with intelligence about a market attack," Ford said, "and ended with justice 31 years overdue. Whatever comes next today mattered. All of it mattered." Priya and Jamie raised their own cups, exhaustion and relief mingling across their expressions, while Layla, who had insisted on staying for the debrief despite the risks to her ongoing cover, offered a quiet nod of shared solidarity. Emily raised her own cup, but her mind drifted inevitably toward the secure communication line, waiting to connect her back to Fort Braddock, toward the conversation she knew she needed to have before she could fully allow herself to feel the weight of everything they'd accomplished lift from her shoulders. She found the privacy of the communications tent. An hour later, her hands steady now, despite the emotional exhaustion of the day, and initiated the connection back to the training facility that had first set her on this impossible, extraordinary path. The line crackled, then connected, and Hardigan's voice came through immediately tight with barely contained anticipation. "Carter, tell me." "It's done, Sergeant," Emily said, her voice thick with emotion she no longer tried to hide. "Malouf's in custody. He's going to face justice for what he did to Sarah, for everything he's done across 31 years of hiding." The silence on the other end of the line stretched long, and Emily could hear, even through the static, the sound of Hardigan's breathing catching unsteady, with an emotion he'd carried buried for 3 decades finally beginning to surface. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough, thick with tears he made no effort to disguise. "You brought her home," he said quietly. "After 31 years, Carter, you finally brought her home." "We brought her home." "Some," Emily corrected, gently echoing the same words she'd offered Layla hours earlier. "You trained me. You gave me her compass. You carried her memory long enough to make sure it eventually reached someone who could finish what she started. This victory belongs to both of you." Hardigan was quiet for a long moment, and Emily could picture him exactly as she had so many times during her training, standing rigid, fighting against decades of hardened composure, finally allowing himself to feel the full weight of grief, finally mercifully beginning to heal. "Thank you," he finally said, his voice breaking slightly on the words, "for everything, for refusing to quit that first morning, for proving every doubt I ever had about you completely, utterly wrong." "You never really doubted me, Sergeant," Emily said softly. "You were just scared of losing someone else the way you lost her. I understand that now better than I did when I first arrived." "Come home safe, Carter," Hardigan said. "Whatever comes next in this deployment, whatever missions still lie ahead, come home safe. That's all I ask now." "I will, Sergeant," Emily said, and this time the promise felt less like an impossible hope and more like a genuine, hard-won certainty. "I promise." In the months that followed, Emily's deployment continued, each mission building upon the trust and capability she'd proven during that harrowing operation in the Mountain Valley, her reputation growing not just as an exceptional marksman, but as a soldier whose judgment under pressure had already, in her very first major operation, closed a wound that had haunted an entire generation of officers and soldiers who had failed to protect Sarah Blackwood 3 decades earlier. Whitfield, upon hearing the full report of the operation, personally traveled to the forward base to meet with Emily, his weathered face carrying an expression of profound, complicated gratitude that no formal commendation could fully capture. "You did something I spent 31 years believing was impossible," he told her, gripping her hand firmly. "You proved that the system can actually work if we're willing to build it properly, if we're willing to trust soldiers like you and Sarah with the responsibility you've both earned." "The system worked this time because people finally learned from what happened to her," Emily replied. "That's the only reason I came home today instead of becoming another name on a memorial wall." Whitfield nodded slowly, old grief and hard-won hope mingling in his weathered expression. "Wayfinder's expanding," he said. "Commands approved additional funding, additional teams, additional safeguards, all built on the lessons your operation just proved out in the field. You didn't just close one chapter of this program's history, Carter. You helped write its future." Word of the operation, carefully sanitized of classified details, eventually made its way back to Fort Braddock, where Danny Reyes, now well into his own advanced training, found himself fielding questions from wide-eyed new recruits who had heard fragments of the story about the woman who'd walked into Hardigan's unit and shattered every expectation anyone had placed on her. "She really did all that?" one skeptical recruit asked Danny one evening in the barracks, disbelief evident in his voice. "The ambush, the pursuit, all of it." "Every bit of it," Danny confirmed, unable to fully suppress the pride in his voice. "I watched her train from day one. Hardigan threw everything he had at her, tried everything to break her, and she just kept getting stronger. Turns out that's exactly what the Army needed." Months later, when Emily's deployment finally concluded, and she returned stateside for a brief period of leave before her next assignment, she made the journey back to Fort Braddock, back to the range where everything had begun with Hardigan's cold, dismissive challenge on that first frost-covered morning. She found him exactly where she expected, alone on the range running solo drills. Despite the late hour, his weathered face lighting with genuine, unguarded warmth the moment he spotted her approaching. "Carter," he said, lowering his rifle, crossing the distance to meet her with quick, purposeful strides. Look at you, barely recognize you without the exhaustion of training weighing you down. Emily laughed, the sound carrying genuine warmth after months of grueling deployment. I brought something back for you, she said, reaching into her jacket and withdrawing Sarah's compass. Its familiar weight now carrying an entirely different significance than it had months earlier. I wanted to return it. I think it's earned its rest. Hartigan stared at the compass for a long moment, old grief and profound gratitude passing across his weathered features. Keep it, he finally said, closing her fingers gently around the worn metal casing. You earned the right to carry her memory forward now more than I ever did. Besides, his mouth quirked into something that looked almost like a genuine smile. I think there's a training class starting next month that could use hearing directly from the soldier who finally proved every doubt about women in this program dead wrong. Emily felt something settle deeply within her chest, a sense of purpose and belonging that had been building since that first hostile morning when Hartigan had told her she'd quit within the week. She had proven him wrong then, in ways neither of them could have fully anticipated, and in doing so had helped rewrite not just her own story but the story of every soldier who would walk through this program's doors in the years to come. I'd be honored, Sergeant, she said. Hartigan nodded, satisfaction and pride evident in every line of his weathered face. Sarah would be proud of you, Carter, he said quietly. I know I keep saying that, but I mean it more with every passing day. You didn't just honor her memory. You built something better than either of us ever thought possible out of the worst thing that ever happened to this program. Emily looked out over the familiar range, the same ground where she had first proven her resolve against every expectation stacked against her, where a sergeant's grief had nearly kept her from ever getting the chance to prove what she was truly capable of, and felt the full weight of everything that journey had demanded finally settle into something that felt unmistakably like triumph. Who is the best marksman? Hartigan had asked that very first morning, though the question had been rhetorical, then a challenge meant to expose weakness rather than invite genuine answer. Emily finally understood, standing on the same ground months later, compass in hand. Legacy secured that the answer had never really been about who could hit a target with the greatest precision. It had been about who could carry impossible weight without breaking, who could face fear and doubt and institutional resistance, and still choose every single day to prove that courage and skill knew no boundaries of gender, of doubt, or of history's old and painful failures. She had stepped forward that first morning, astonished everyone who doubted her, and in doing so had finally completely and unequivocally answered the question for good, proving beyond any remaining doubt that the best marksman this army had ever trained had been standing quietly in that formation all along, waiting only for someone brave enough to finally give her the chance to prove it.